This day has finally arrived. Good morning, everyone. I'm Julie Tennille. My pronouns are she, her, and I am Principal Investigator and Project Director of the Health Resources and Services Administration grant we have branded EPIC, which stands for Education and Programming for Integrated Care. Welcome to our Symposium on Integrated Care with trans and gender diverse children and adolescents. I'd like to thank our amazing team, beginning with Nadine Bean, our retired professor emerita and visionary for the first funded grant in 2017, Cheryl Neal McFall, co-PI and program evaluator, Wendy Myers, our grant program coordinator, our research assistant, Sarah Fisher, and our graduate assistant, Fatima Bakayoko. This symposium is about confidence, and it's about you. Today, you have dedicated your time to increasing your confidence in learning from your mistakes, in listening to one another, in not being afraid to make future mistakes, and always asking questions. I am confident that this amazing lineup of experts, persons with lived experience, and speakers that we have carefully curated over the last year will enable all of us to learn from this day. Take the time to view their full bios on our website. They are spectacular. I am confident that you will leave today understanding that with clear training on evidence-based policy and practice with trans and gender diverse children and adolescents, together, we will be destined to create more dignified and caring integrated care spaces and service spaces for our children. Yes, these are our children, and you've set aside time on this day to show them your commitment to affirming and validating their lives, their health, and their well-being. So at this time, I'm delighted to introduce Rhonda Jackson from the Health Resources and Services Administration, who will make some remarks and introduce our first keynote speaker of the day.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Julie. I'm Rhonda Jackson. I am with the Health Resources and Services Administration, Office of Intergovernmental and External Affairs. I'm very pleased to be here this morning and welcome you all to this exciting day of learning. HRSA is committed to improving health outcomes and achieving health equity through access to quality services and a skilled health workforce. We would like to thank the Westchester University Behavioral Health Workforce Education and Training Program, which receives funding from HRSA, for hosting today's session. We're very excited to support Julie, Westchester University, and the full team because they possess such huge expertise and do incredibly impactful work. So thank you again. Your partnership and expertise in helping to support the development and continuing education of our workforce is a valuable resource. Today's topic focuses on the integration of care and support. Behavioral health remains a priority for HRSA and is demonstrated across many programs and initiatives. In addition to behavioral health and workforce education and training, HRSA also supports programs such as Centers of Excellence on Behavioral Health Integration, the Health Center Program, and telehealth resource centers, which also provide technical assistance on a wide range of topics, but not limited to, but also including telebehavioral health. To learn more about HRSA programs that span across the areas of maternal and child health, primary care, workforce development, and other topics, you can always visit HRSA.gov. The HRSA Office of Intergovernmental and External Affairs, which I'm a part of, is always interested in building new partnerships. If you would like to learn more about HRSA investments in your community, your area, and your areas of study related to workforce development or behavioral health, you can also always reach out to our office and we'll be happy to speak with you more. Thanks to all of you for all of the work you do every day and your commitment. And once again, thank you to Westchester University for hosting this session to increase capacity and play a role in ensuring quality healthcare access for all populations. So now to my most important task of the morning. I have the honor of introducing this morning's keynote speaker, Dr. Sandra Bloom. She is a board certified psychiatrist and currently associate professor of health management policy at the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University. Dr. Bloom is considered a pioneer for her work in the field of traumatic stress studies and is a past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. She is recognized nationally and internationally as a founder of the Sanctuary model, in which over 400 social service, juvenile justice, and mental health organizations have been trained. In addition, she has written 3 books about this Sanctuary model and has also published over 160 peer-reviewed articles. And to add even more, Dr. Bloom is currently chair for the campaign for trauma-informed policy and practice. Our office has also had the pleasure of collaborating with Dr. Bloom in the past and have used her for her expertise. And I know that you are in for an enlightening and informative session. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Bloom.
Thank you, Rhonda. My assignment from Julie was to, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to do this, was to talk about the challenges to identity development in adolescents. And of course, I'm a trauma expert, so there are some things I'm going to be emphasizing about development. And I'm going to use the term gender diversity for the sake of time, and include in that all of you folks who are transgender folks. And I hope that is okay. I couldn't figure out any other, because the initials now have gotten to be so many of them that it really inhibits conversation. So let's get started. Come on, go. Okay. So I want you all to think about the world that you've been born into, where you were born, the time that you were born in, your own ancestry, ethnicity, religion, customs, your skin color, your genital organs, and the resources that your family and community had when you were born, which often defines our worthiness, access, education, and our status. And the point I want to make is that with all of those, all of which are social constructions, you had no choice about any of this. This is what you were born into, and yet these become key determinants of your health and your well-being. Social constructs are a big deal, but they don't exist in objective reality. They are a result of human interaction. What we decide as humans exists. There are brute facts which exist independently of what anybody thinks, and social facts that depend on human thinking. So we define certain objects, like a kind of paper, as being money, and we can change that. But the brute facts really exist independently of us. But much of our life is built around social constructs, and here's a list of them. Some of them: race, class, gender, sexual behavior, language, religion, government, family, marriage, deviance, all of that are what we make up as people that change over time. Well, what's the harm in social constructs? Well, the first place, they determine who will be stigmatized. So to stigmatize somebody, you need to define difference, and you have to have the power to do that. You have to have the power to create stereotypes. So you have to have the power to say all of these kinds of people, whatever, are bad or inferior in reference to these kind of people who are good and superior. And then you can bring to bear some agreed upon ideology. Again, ideology that human beings have made up. A religion, an empire, a nation state, an economic system that sees itself in some way threatened by the labeled people. But once they've been labeled as a threat to any ideology, then people of the powerful group feel justified in employing the full amount of disapproval, rejection, exclusion, discrimination, and cruelty. As soon as an individual or group is stigmatized, the process of dehumanization begins. And that's the denial of full humanness in other people and the cruelty and suffering that goes along with it. It's viewing and treating other people like they're not fully human. And it actually is the beginning of any atrocity human beings perpetrate on one another or ever have. The other two processes, and this is important for what I'm going to talk about ahead, is making it routine, it's just the way things are, and authorizing people in authority to approve the conduct that goes along with dehumanization and stigmatization. There are three mechanisms of stigma: individual, what people do to themselves; interpersonal, what other people do to them; and then what's in the structure, what gets incorporated into policy and procedure. Well, stigmatizing structural processes directed at any gender diverse person in the past in the West have included routinely imprisoning them or executing them, labeling them as mentally ill and forcing them into asylums, subjecting them to castration, hypothalamotomy, which is cutting out the thalamus, hormone injections, clitorectomy, which is cutting out the clitoris, hysterectomy, or ovarectomy, supposedly to change their orientation and behavior. So it has not been an easy road for people who are gender diverse. And there are still many countries, those here in the dark red, where stigma of being gender diverse can get you executed, can get you killed. And there are still many countries where stigma can mutilate. So these are all countries where girls and women come from that have experienced female genital mutilation. So, and the reason I bring that up for us is because the CDC back in 2013 estimated that there were already over 500,000 girls and women here who were victims of female genital mutilation. In case you don't know what it is, it's all the procedures that involve the partial or total removal of all the external female genitalia. And this is not for religious reasons. This is social constructions. It's mostly carried out on young girls, sometime between infancy and adolescence. And I couldn't find any research on the issue of female genital mutilation and gender diversity, probably because the countries where these girls come from are also the countries where you can get killed if you admit that you're gender diverse. So we don't have good data, and we don't know yet much that I could find anyhow about what's happening here. So in the US, stigma depends on a lot where you live. Of the estimated 9.5 million gender diverse adults that live in the US, approximately half of them, or over half, live in states that permit gender-based discrimination, with African American gender diverse individuals more highly concentrated in those states in the South, Midwest, and mountain states. So what's the harm in social constructs? An inestimable amount of human suffering and death, all of which are completely preventable with a change in social constructs. And that's really why we're here today. Gender is a social construction. It's been defined as an institutionalized system of social practices for constituting people as two significantly different categories, men and women, and then organizing social relations of inequality on the basis of that difference. Now we're using the term very usefully, heterosexism, a system of attitudes, bias, and discrimination in favor of female-male sexuality and relationships, and includes the presumption that other people are heterosexual and that that's the norm, and therefore it's superior. And it's very analogous to sexism and racism, describing an ideological system that denies, denigrates, and stigmatizes any other form of behavior, identity, relationship, or community. Well, who defines what's normal? I got really interested in this when I was doing the research for this talk. And in the pre-literate world, of course, there were powerful gods and goddesses. With the advent of monotheism, however, God becomes masculine, and the origin of evil comes from females, and patriarchy becomes the dominant political viewpoint. Monotheistic cultures are essentially patriarchal social systems. So for several thousand years, men have been defining what is normal and what is not. The way you do that is that you divide things into opposite categories, dichotomies. And in this way, the people who get to be saying what is normal, their positions become unquestioned. And then anything that isn't normal is labeled as bad. So the dominant voice in this country has always been white men. In other countries, it's men of color, but it's always been men in recorded history. Probably not before that, but that's what it been from what we know. The other records either didn't exist or were burned. So what's the harm in social constructs? I think it creates what I've called a traumatogenic culture. What is that? Where sociocultural beliefs, norms, practices, and trends cause, encourage, or contribute to the generation of multiple intersecting traumatic acts. So the way a society is organized can support or mitigate the individual's experience of crippling psychological trauma. So when we accept the perspective that social conditions can either directly traumatize people or make it more likely that they will be traumatized, then the organization of our whole society becomes a critical focus. One of the dimensions of that is hate-based violence. And this is what gender diverse people experience, is hate-based violence is defined as violence against a person, but really against a whole people, that is motivated by bias and prejudice against that person's perceived group membership. Now, not all hate-based violence becomes a hate crime, because that's narrowly defined and it really depends on where you are. But it's important to recognize that all hate-based violence is intended to send a message, not just to the individual who's being hurt, but to the whole community to which that person belongs. And it's intended to instill fear and anxiety and inflict psychological damage, even though it may be a physical assault. But it's also for all these reasons, and to diminish a sense of being a part of that community, and if possible, to get rid of them entirely. So that's what the Nazis did in Germany in the 30s and 40s, was try to get rid of all the Jews completely. And that's hate-based violence. In 2013, a Pew Research Center sampled lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender adults and included questions about 6 types of incidents, ranging from things like getting poor service in restaurants to physical attacks, and found that 2/3 had experienced at least one of them. 3 in 10 said that they had been threatened or physically attacked on grounds of their gender identity or sexual orientation. 4% just in the preceding year before the survey. So you can count on people who are gender diverse having had some very bad experiences at this point in time. In the US, it's been estimated that about 16% of the hate crimes reported in 2017. Remember, that's a conservative definition of what that is, and not all of the crimes get actually listed as hate crimes, but they were related. So 16% related to clear just sexual orientation, and about 2% related to perceived gender identity. And most of the incidents that gender diverse adults experience don't get reported to anybody. It just, if you know that it's not going to do any good, why would you? You're just going to get hurt. Social attitudes are social constructs, and they can change. So the historic trends in national gender diverse prevalence estimates that something's going on that is improving acceptance and identification. So this is from a general social survey. This is from a Gallup survey, and you can see the dates. So things are improving, at least in parts of the country. And findings from 10 states using population-based data from the state level youth risk behavioral surveillance system shows that the prevalence of 14 to 18-year-olds defined as non-heterosexual between 2009 and 2017 doubled. So adolescents must be feeling somewhat safer identifying themselves. And social attitudes have been changing. In 1972, the General Population Survey reported that 73% of American adults believed that homosexuality was always wrong. By 2008, that had changed to 52%. By 2018, that was down to 32%. And the Gallup analysis shows similar trends. In 2008, 55% of US adults thought that gay and lesbian relationships between consenting adults should be legal. By 2019, that had risen to 73%. So this is a good example of how social constructs can change, and with the proper amount of activism can change rapidly. Okay, I realized when I was going to tell you about the challenges to adolescent development, I couldn't talk about that without talking about the children. And so in this picture, the children are the larvae, and then what comes out at the other end as an adult is the butterfly. Well, children, of course, come into the world and are constantly observing everything. They're observing differences between people and what makes what important to look at and to know. By their first birthday, babies can distinguish between male and female faces, but it's the adults that constantly point it out because we are using gender nouns all the time and pronouns. So that tells children, without you having to say anything specifically about the relationship between genders, how many genders there are, and what it means. Around age 2, children become conscious of the physical differences between boys and girls. Before their 3rd birthday, most children can easily label themselves as either a boy or a girl. By age 4, most kids have a stable sense of their gender identity. They're noticing who has power and who doesn't. And out of that, their brain creates these rigid, overgeneralized rules and categories, these crude stereotypes. So if they see women cooking and being teachers and men playing football and firefighters, then the stereotypes they develop is that men never cook and women never fight fires. And they'll start to really notice the power difference when they notice things like all US presidents have been men and have been white men. And they're going to derive causal references from that. So if the most powerful position in the country is always held by men, then men must be inherently smarter and more capable than women. And as kids build up these gender stereotypes, they start conforming to them, in part because they're rewarded for doing so. Research has shown that parents, particularly dads, preferentially offer kids gender appropriate toys, reward kids for playing with them, and scold them when they're not. Parents are also more tolerant when sons are physically aggressive with peers and siblings than when daughters act that way. Teachers also tend to encourage gender stereotypical behavior, particularly among girls. And then peers pile the pressure on, beginning very young. Kids, boys especially, punish each other, sometimes really cruelly, when gender rules are broken, and often exclude kids that are not following gender rules. One study watched preschool boys, toddlers, while they were playing, and found that when boys showed interest in stereotypically girls' toys, like, dollhouses and dresses, other boys interrupted by hitting and ridiculing them. And as kids continue to practice these gendered behaviors, they become routine and they weave into their own identity. Research also suggests that stereotypical beliefs about gender are stronger among boys than girls. Well, that's probably because boys feel more cultural and parental pressure to conform to gender expectations than girls do. It's just less culturally acceptable in our culture for boys to pretend to be princesses than it is for girls to play Superman. And boys know that, and they respond accordingly. So children are learning very early, without anybody having to really say it, who is stigmatized and who is not. Identity is constructed through our social relationships, through what we do with each other. And that's how we construct our daily lives. To the extent that your identity is not socially approved, you are going to be made to suffer. You are stigmatized, and that has enormous consequences. Numerous studies show that gender diverse people experience high rates of violence and victimization that begin early in the life course, go through adolescence, and persist into adulthood. Decades of research has shown that US gender diverse, including transgender populations, experience adverse childhood experiences and adult victimization at rates that exceed those of their heterosexual and cisgender counterparts. And I'm going to assume you all know about the adverse childhood experiences study, because the idea that these kids and adolescents experience more ACEs is terrifying, horrifying, considering how high the rates of childhood adversity are in the general population. And then there's the issue of minority stress. So ACEs can intersect with other forms of victimization perpetrated against gender diverse people, like racism. So, or coming from an ethnic minority that is being discriminated against. So the stigma experienced by gender diverse population and the minority stress can therefore complicate the consequences of childhood trauma. And then there's some special things you need to know about kids who have been sexually abused, because it's so common. 1 in 3 girls before they're 18, 1 in 5, 1 in 6 boys before they're 18 are in the general population are abused. So a lack of safe arenas means that these kids cannot really protect themselves. They're not adequately protected from sexual exploitation and abuse. And often they're in the whatever sex education curricula exists doesn't necessarily contain any information about same-sex sexual activity. And often service providers don't want to know, they don't ask, they don't initiate any kind of conversation about gender diversity. Fear that disclosing sexual abuse, particularly if the abuse has come from the same sex, makes gender diverse kids fear that they'll be outed when they're not ready. And they often feel really uncomfortable disclosing and may avoid disclosing what happened to them longer than other kids. And all other kids are very hesitant to disclose. Gender diverse youth who experience sexual abuse by someone of the same sex may feel that they somehow caused the abuse, and they may internalize negative feelings about their gender diversity, causing them a lot more turmoil. Youth who identify as heterosexual or have not yet actually defined themselves may think that being abused by someone of the same sex makes them then gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And a youth of any orientation may not disclose abuse by a same-sex perpetrator for fear of being labeled what they're not ready or want to be labeled as. Okay, So now let's transit into adolescent development. How long does it take? A long time. It goes now, as far as brain development goes, until the mid-20s. And it's divided into 3 stages: early, middle, and late. Early, age 10 to 14, middle, 15 to 17, late, 18 to 24. And I'm going to focus on early adolescence, because if problems have happened to you in childhood and then early adolescent, they're likely to continue through the middle and late stages, because often adolescent development gets arrested wherever traumatic experience occurred. So let's look at what the tasks are. There are a number of critical tasks that adolescents have to achieve to transit into adulthood. First, they have to adjust to a new physical sense of self and adjust to a sexually maturing body and the feelings that go along with it. They have to develop and apply abstract thinking skills. They have to define a personal sense of who they are. They have to adopt a personal value system. They have to renegotiate relationships with parents and caregivers. They have to develop stable and productive peer relationships and meet the demands of increasingly mature roles and responsibilities. That is a lot for an immature being. We always look at these larvae to butterfly stages. Like we focus on the butterfly. We don't really think necessarily about what it's like to be a caterpillar and then go through all the changes that you have to go through in order to become the butterfly. And these are the changes. While gender diverse adolescents have increased rates of what's called poly-victimization in the family, at school, by loved ones, teachers, peers, they have experienced in all likelihood multiple forms of victimization relative to their non-gender diverse peers. That's what the research shows. The Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Educational Network, glsen.org, have been doing school climate surveys for years. And this is the most recent one from 2019. And what they look at is indicators of a negative school climate, very up my Strasse because of the work in sanctuary and now presence. What they look at is hearing biased remarks, including homophobic remarks in school, feeling unsafe because of your personal characteristics, whatever they are, missing classes or days of school because of safety reasons, experiencing harassment and assault in school, and experiencing discriminatory policies and practices at school. I'm going to give you some details, but this summarizes their conclusions from this climate survey. Schools nationwide are hostile environments for a distressing number of gender diverse students, the overwhelming majority of whom routinely hear anti-LGBTQ language and experience victimization and discrimination at school. As a result, many gender diverse students avoid school activities or miss school entirely. Well, let's look at early adolescence. During this developmental period, adolescents are going through puberty. Now, for males, this begins way after girls, about 1 to 2 years, and it accelerates more slowly. So I want you to think back to when you were going through puberty. Probably most of you will remember it's awkward. You're not, doesn't feel like your body anymore. You can't do the things you used to do. And oh, it matters a lot. Looking in the mirror a lot of concern about body image, very high level of self-consciousness, and you're looking around at all your peers as the standard for what's normal. And you're worrying about being normal and everything looking right. And this goes along at the same time with sexually maturing body and feelings. The growth spurt for girls starts at age 10 till 14, it's the biggest time. But for boys, it's 12 to 16. I remember what it felt like. You're shy, you shut the door, didn't want anybody coming in, and you were feeling things you might have never felt before, and experimenting with your own body and worrying about whether it was okay or whether it's normal. And that traditionally, of course, meant being heterosexual, being attracted to the opposite sex, not the same sex, or not being attracted at all. And where opposite sex contact happens, it's often in groups and parties. Well, some kids have a gender identity that's different from their gender assigned at birth, and many have interests and hobbies that align with that. Some kids don't identify with either gender, and they may feel like they're somewhere in between or have no gender. And the normal degree of self-consciousness, notice I said normal, meaning heterosexual, may be greatly increased for these kids because they're really confused about all this. They may try to stop puberty. Eating disorders, it's one of the things they do. They stop the process of puberty. And they may get involved in self-harming behavior as a way to try to make it go away, make it stop. Now, what about for cisgender adolescent boys and girls? Well, as they transition into adolescence, the gender stereotypes shift in an important way. They become more sexualized. So research suggests that adolescents with strong gender stereotypes start to believe that boys are constantly seeking out sex and that girls should always look pretty and do whatever they can to attract boys' sexual attention. Studies also find that the more strongly boys believe those earlier stereotypes, the more likely they are to make sexual comments, tell sexual jokes, and to grab women and girls. What's dangerous about this is that these stereotypes can morph during adolescence and become more sinister. And they can become the idea that girls really are just sex objects and that boys can't control it, are sexual obsessed, and just the way guys are. That is going to strongly have an impact as well on kids that are still trying to figure this all out and that are gender diverse. Then another task is to develop and apply abstract thinking skills. So they're learning how to think more abstractly, but in the early adolescence, it's still very rudimentary. Their senses of cause and effect relationship still underdeveloped. And this is all based on brain development. This is cognitive processes because the brain is changing enormously during this period. And then, as we know, it's really important that they define a personal sense of identity. And they're doing that in early adolescence, often in very awkward ways. They're questioning everything. They have to move away from their families of origin in order to get ready to have a family of choice. But that means getting clear about your own identity. Who am I? Where do I fit in? Around all kinds of things, gender, physical attributes, sexuality, ethnicity, all of it. One result is that adolescents experiment a lot with different kinds of looks and hair and manner and music and everything. And they're trying to figure out what is my true self by trying on, like we try on different clothes.
Everything's frozen. They see.
Julie, they can't see this?
Nope, it's all good. Keep going, Sandy. Sorry about that.
Okay. So these kids, of course, if you remember, or you've been living with an early adolescent, nobody understands. That's the way they feel. And they're very worried about being normal, using their peers as a standard, and they reject things of childhood. Now, when you think about a gender diverse kid, there may be no other peers that that child is in school with, particularly in less populated areas and smaller schools. They may not be able to find anybody that thinks the way they think, looks the way they look, interested in the things they're interested in. The process by which members of gender diverse communities come out is a very complex process, and it really important in affirming one's identity and gender identity, and will be determined a lot by what's going on in school and what's going on with peers and what's going on in one's family and all kinds of socioeconomic and political influences. And this is where the discriminatory school policies are really disturbing. So the majority of kids who were surveyed reported personally experiencing discriminatory policies and practices at school. This is 2019. Well, this is right before the pandemic hit. Things like being prevented from using bathrooms aligned with their gender identity, being disciplined for public displays of affection, that other kids were not, prevented from using locker rooms aligned with their gender identity, prevented from using chosen names and pronouns, prevented from wearing clothes considered inappropriate based on their gender, prohibited from discussing or writing about any of this in school assignments, prohibited from including gender diverse topics in school extracurricular activities, restricted from forming or promoting a gender diverse group, prevented from wearing clothing or any items that supported gender diversity issues, prevented or discouraged from participating in school sports because they were gender diverse, prevented from attending a dance or function with someone of the same gender, and disciplined for simply identifying as being gender diverse. So it's not hard to think about the damage that is doing in the process of adolescent development. Without any social affirmation, in fact, with being labeled deviant, these kids are suffering enormously from what are social constructs. The hate-based violence that affects individuals who identify as gender diverse can start in childhood and include multiple experiences. Gender diverse kids experience higher rates of early victimization than their gender conforming counterparts. Of course, that's going to have a negative effect on mental health. And the most notorious case was Matthew Shepard, who was a 21-year-old student at the University of Wyoming, kidnapped and tortured and died from his wounds, which led to the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which President Obama signed. Now, another task is that adolescents have to adopt a personal value system. So they come into adolescence with their family's value system, and then they start challenging them in order to figure out what their value system is going to be. That may come out of adolescence with exactly the same value system, but they need to go through this period of trying on other ideas, which can be very disturbing to parents. And as they become able to take the perspective of others, they may place the needs of others over their own self-interest. And these are some of the values that they need to wrestle with. And you can see when you look at those values, like around power and justice and tradition and stimulation, that gender diverse kids are going to have very different kinds of experiences with what other people's values have been and how they've been applied to them. Now, they have to also renegotiate the relationship with parents and caregivers, because they have to go through the being able to have their own family at some point in time. Remember, in our early evolutionary history, children were already having babies, starting families. We discourage that in our culture at this age, but it still happens. So overall, they have to separate from their families of origin, but particularly in early adolescence, they're really awkward about it. And parents are often really thrown off by this enormous change that their kids have gone through, and they don't understand it. So it all becomes very threatening to everything about family life. They're often very argumentative, arguing, challenging everything, but they're still very closely attached to their parental figures. They still need them. They just need them in a different way. And it's really confusing for parents, but really important for kids that when they need the parents, they are there for them. And so these listening skills in parents become increasingly important. So it's a terrible, terrible thing when a gender diverse child actually is coming out, finding ways to talk about it, and is then getting rejected by their family, sometimes really harshly rejected. 29% of gender diverse youth have experienced homelessness, been kicked out, or run away. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual young adults who reported higher levels of family rejection during adolescence were over 8 times more likely to have attempted suicide, about 6 times more likely to have high levels of depression, 3 to 4 times more likely to use illegal drugs and have unprotected sex. So, and this is compared to peers, gender diverse peers who were not rejected. So this is incredibly important and needs intervention at the time. Gender diverse youth represent between 30 and 43% of those served by drop-in centers, street outreach programs, and housing programs. Gender diverse youth receiving services in any of those programs report experiencing family rejection and abuse at rates of 68% and 54%. And that these were the primary factors contributing to their homelessness. Well, kids also have to develop stable and productive peer relationships because they're going to become then what serves them for the rest of their life. Their friendships, the way they build relationships, what loyalty and trust that you establish. So these are really important. Parents will become very distressed about how important peer relationships are, but it's just a normal part of adolescence. And it's shaping their self-concepts and their interactions. And they need stable friendships. In early adolescence, they're often pretty unstable because there's so much developmentally happen. And as they progress through adolescence, friendships often become much more stable. And they're choosing friendships based on qualities and values that are important to them. So they're likely, heterosexual kids are likely to have same-sex friends and group activities, and they're often forming cliques, and they're very afraid of being rejected by any of their peers. So you can see how gender diverse kids would encounter enormous problems with that if there are not other gender diverse kids that they can develop relationships with. Peer-based adversity is a real problem for these kids. Gender diverse disproportionately encounter violence and victimization related to cisgender youth. They are bullied electronically and at school. They're threatened and injured with weapons at school. They experience sexual or physical dating violence and feel unsafe going to school and coming back from school. They experience all kinds of anti-LGBTQ remarks and harassment. And this is more data from the school survey. Most of them, virtually all of them, heard gay used in a negative way, homophobic language all over the place. The vast majority experience harassment or assault based on who they were and who they are. And it might have been their gender or gender expression or religion or race or ethnicity or disability, but almost all of them. Over half felt unsafe at school. A third missed at least an entire day just in the month prior to the survey because they felt unsafe or comfortable. Almost 10% missed 4 or more days in the previous month. Almost half avoided gender segregated space because they felt uncomfortable, and things like they avoided bathrooms, which then leads to urinary tract infections, and they avoided locker rooms, which means you try to avoid gym, and so you don't get physical exercise that other kids do. Most reported avoiding school functions and extracurricular activities because they didn't feel safe, and nearly a fifth reported having ever changed schools because they were not safe. More than half who were harassed or assaulted didn't report it to anybody. And 60% of those who did report said nothing was done. and the kids were basically told to ignore it. So schools are not handling this situation well. They were nearly 3 times as likely to have missed school. And of course, that's going to affect, all of this is going to affect school performance. So they had lower grade point averages than students who were less often harassed. They were nearly twice as likely to report that they didn't plan to go on to school. They were nearly twice as likely to have been disciplined at school. And they had a lower self-esteem and school belonging levels and higher levels of depression. Data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health revealed that gender diverse youth, particularly girls, were significantly more likely than their heterosexual peers to be expelled, stopped by police, arrested before age 18, convicted as a juvenile, convicted as an adult, despite no higher rates of misbehavior. So what the researchers believe is that the school-based zero tolerance policies disproportionately levy punishment against gender diverse kids, and particularly if they're youth of color, for minor infractions that they don't levy against heterosexual kids. Well, the final task of adolescents is to meet the demands of increasingly mature roles and responsibilities. So adolescents gradually take on the roles they're supposed to. They learn the skills necessary. They're in early adolescence, they change their vocational goals a lot, but it settles down as they go through middle and later adolescence. Middle adolescence, physical growth is slowed for females, continues for males. Brain is still actively developing. The kids are moving through this period. Think back to when you were 16. It wasn't an easy time. Late adolescence, by late adolescence, you're settling down, your body physical developments have finished. What's happening though is your brain is still developing like crazy. And young people experience more emotional stability and independence, but not necessarily for the gender diverse kids because of everything they've been through. They can get hung up on earlier tasks because they haven't been able to complete them adequately. And that can lead to all kinds of mental health problems. This is from a study of non-binary LGBT adults in the US who reported having problems with each of the problems. And if you look at suicidal ideation, it was virtually everybody. And 39% had made suicide attempts, 74% had non-suicidal self-injurious behavior. A study among gender diverse youth found that physical victimization was, as I would think, significantly associated with PTSD, which is not a good thing to have because it doesn't just go away. Among transgender youth, 35% reported attempting suicide in the prior 10 months to the study, compared to 9% of cisgender female and 5.5% of cisgender male. And among other gender diverse youth, 23.5% report attempting suicide in the prior 12 months, compared to 6.4, which is bad enough, of heterosexual youth. A huge problem. If you need to address those kinds of problems in gender diverse kids, you have to be thinking about learning about what we call now complex PTSD or developmental trauma disorder. The problem is it's not a current psychiatric classification. And all those people will use PTSD as a diagnosis. It rarely captures, nor do any of the other diagnoses that are used, the multiple and chronic exposure to trauma that these kids have had. Other diagnoses you might see are depression, ADHD, oppositional defiant conduct disorder, generalized anxiety, separation anxiety, reactive attachment disorder, or you may see a child that comes in with 5 or 6 of those diagnoses. And if that's the case, what you really have before you is a child who's dealing with complex PTSD, because each of those other diagnoses only captures a part of that person. The core deficits are not being addressed. There's 7 of those: attachment, their biology, their cognition, dissociation, emotional regulation, and self-concept and behavioral control. So I'll briefly go through this. I know, Julie, we're running out of time. So I'll just quickly go through this and you'll have the slides. You can learn about this in more detail. But the attachment issues are problems in relationships, all kinds of problems with boundaries, with trusting or being distrustful. The biology becomes really dysregulated beginning in childhood for kids who experience a lot of trauma and adversity in a multidimensional way. So it affects their brain development, their physical development, happens in all kinds of ways. Their cognitions, because the brain is developing at the same time, you may see kids with all kinds of cognitive problems in attention and focus, learning difficulties, language development. And then for dissociation, these distinct alterations in states of consciousness that are likely to have begun in childhood, but that may be really affecting their development at this point in time. They have a lot of difficulty managing emotions, regulating their emotional responses to all different kinds of situations. And of course, all of this impacts on your sense of self and your self-esteem and how you see yourself. But all of the things that we call symptoms in psychiatry really can be explained by all those other domains that become dysregulated for the child. And the behaviors then are the outcome. They're not the cause, they're the outcome. But of course, kids get into all kinds of vicious cycles as a result. Well, the presence of third gender people, as well as what contemporary gender diverse culture would consider non-binary people, have been recorded in almost all cultures across human history. So who or what does gender diversity threaten so much? Well, just as racial equality threatens white supremacy, economic equality threatens capitalism, gender diversity threatens patriarchal social structures and beliefs that insist on male superiority. So these are really human rights issues. Love is a human right. Gender diverse people, children, adolescents, and adults, as I've said, have faced innumerable human rights violations, sometimes sanctioned by governments, laws, policies, and societal norms, which is exhausting. It's exhausting to have to deal with all this and try to grow up and to remain vigilant against violence and discrimination. So you are working just by attending this seminar in a human rights framework, because that's what we have to understand this as. Yes, they cause individual problems, everything I've talked about, but this is not an individual problem. This is a social problem. And we have to remain vigilant. Within the first month post-inauguration, Trump's administration rescinded the joint guidance from the US Departments of Ed and Justice that directed educational institutions to include gender identity within Title IX. During the first 5 months of 2017, state legislators introduced over 100 anti-LGBT bills in 20 states. In 2018, the same administration announced the creation of a new conscience and religious freedom division within HHS that it was designed to protect health professionals so that they could discriminate against patients based on their own religious or moral beliefs. And it's a system expected to target reproductive justice and LGBT rights. And I couldn't find any indication that these had been rolled back. Maybe they have. I hope they have. Then, of course, you know that the Supreme Court struck down all state bans on same-sex marriage, legalized it, and President Biden immediately signed an executive order after his inauguration with giving a lot more protections. So you know about that, but it's not enough. We need the ERA to be part of the Constitution, and it needs to protect women and all gender diverse people. Now, aren't women already protected? 80% of people in the US think that we are. They're wrong. Originalist justice like the late Scalia and his ilk do not believe that the Constitution rightfully protects from discrimination on the basis of sex at all, even under the Equal Protection Clause. A little bit of history, in case you don't know it, about the ERA. It was written by Alice Paul in 1923. The Equal Rights Amendment would put protection for women and hopefully other marginalized genders directly into the US Constitution. So equality of law of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And those are the 3 sections of the amendment. Well, it was finally passed after coming up in every Congress for 50 years in 1972. A lot of fanfare. There was an active women's lib movement at the time. When the ERA passed, the legislation included a 7-year deadline. Then it was extended to a deadline until 1982. But by that time, Reagan was president, and conservative and religious groups whipped up anti-ERA fervor, often using anti-LGBTQ sentiment. So it was beating the drum about stopping legalizing gay marriage and how awful it would be to have unisex bathrooms. And so it fell short of the 38 states needed for ratification. According to a 2016 survey, a whopping 94% of people in the US would support an amendment enshrining gender equality into the Constitution. Half a century on, it still has not passed, but in 2017, Nevada became the first state in 45 years to pass it, then Illinois in 2018, Virginia in 2020. Now there are the necessary 38 states for ratification, but it's probably, I talked to a friend of mine last night, it seems that it's now in the courts, and still a lot of talk about whether it's going to, even if it's ratified, if it's the same one, if it would cover all genders. So you need to get involved in this issue. And we need it put in the Constitution. Okay, I've left you on the slideshow some websites I use, a lot of my references in case you want them. There's some YouTube videos that you might find helpful, and that's my website. So that'll all be on your handout. And now I just want to finish with showing you a short documentary from a child talking to their mom about their own experience that I think is a good way to round this up. Okay, Julie, take it over and I'll stop the share.
All right.
I'm trying to figure out how to put this in words.
Take your time.
We had that little talk and I said, I've been hiding this for a long time. And you said, okay. And you accepted it. I feel like one of the best times you ever really understood me and my gender was that very first evening, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It was so hard keeping that secret. I never intended to tell you. I felt like I shouldn't. I mean, like, even I was doubtful. I'm just a little kid. How would I know? And then my brain went and took over and said, you're doing this And I went ahead and said it. And I didn't mean to tell you, but now I'm so glad I did. Do I really care what everybody thinks? Yes. Everybody on this earth, every human being, cares at least one tiny thing about what people think about it.
Yeah.
But if you still have that heavy weight of caring about it too much, then it will stop you from being who you are.
Yeah.
I thought I wasn't ready. Because it was kind of overwhelming to tell you. And talking about it, I was starting to feel overwhelmed again. Because I'm just feeling that come back to me.
Big push. Big push. Push.
Here's me! It's probably the best memory I have. Telling you I'm not a girl for the first time, but it's probably the worst too, because that was so hard for me.
I'm sorry it was hard. Hey.
So Sandra, is there anything you wanted to share after that video before we get started with some questions?
No, it's fine. I think it speaks for itself.
Absolutely, totally agree. And Sandra, thank you so much for such an impactful presentation. There's so much to think about, so much advocacy, and so much to unpack here. So I just wanted to take a few minutes and ask a few questions from our audience members. But the first question we have is, what influences can we have on children who are not necessarily our own, but that we interact with, who have parents who are reinforcing these stereotypes?
Yeah, I think it's really about respecting children, where whoever they are, whatever phase they're going through, it doesn't matter. It's that you don't have to agree with the parents. You're not going to immediately be able to change those stereotypes, but parents want to have respectful children. But the way children learn respect is by being respected. So I think you have to put it with those kinds of parents in that term. And then there may be a difference between a father and a mother. And you may have to separate them so that you can get one of the parents who understands more to be more supportive and respectful of where the child's at. And the other parent then may help the one that may be a problem. So, it's family therapy techniques that may have to happen.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And Sarah, did you want to go ahead and ask the next question?
Sure. So with respect to school safety and attendance, has this information been shared with the school board to help inform policy changes?
Good question. I don't know. I think that I'd recommend that you go onto the glsen.org, the Gay and Lesbian and Straight Education Network. They're the ones that have done the studies repeatedly. So they're a good resource for finding out what has actually been done about that. And is that information widely known by the schools? I doubt it. And it'll vary from school district to school district. So, that's why I wanted to share it with all of you and make sure you had access to that website, because I think it's one of the places where anybody who has kids and has an interaction with a school can deliberately advocate for what's happening. And just having a school do an informal survey would be an improvement probably over a lot of what happens. So, but I don't know. I doubt it. I doubt that most schools are informed about this. Look at what they've been struggling with for the past year. And this last one came out in 2019. So that's before we've shut down. So schools are up against so many barriers right now that, but the pandemic may actually lead people to be more sympathetic to the trials that gender diverse kids are experiencing, because everybody's been experiencing a lot of trial and tribulation. Always look for windows of opportunity to intervene.
So I will ask, you did answer a couple questions privately in the Q&A, but I'm going to ask them publicly so everybody can hear your answers. With respect of the discriminatory practices, are you able to identify the breakdown based upon geographic region? For example, is it higher in other areas such as the South versus the North or the Midwest? And then the second part of that question was, or even include the different type of school environment, for example, faith-based school environment versus public charter school environment, please.
Yeah, is somewhere in, it's research-based, I didn't do it, but the indicators are that the discriminatory practices are more dominant in the South, the Midwest, or at least parts of the Midwest, and the mountain states. So, it's going to be the red states. And as far as school, what kind of school, I don't know. I don't, and again, I would suggest that you look at the Gay and Lesbian and Straight Education Network website and get in touch with the people there. They may have a breakdown. I just didn't look for it. Here's a comment about policy 252. Hi, Emma. For the Philadelphia School District addresses some of these topics. So that's for those of us in Philly, that's a good thing. Go ahead.
What are the first steps we can take to push these systems in the direction of change? For example, government or other authority figures misgendering children and general attitudes that deny the autonomy of children.
Oh, the general attitude thing is huge. I mean, children, we are the only country in the world never to have yet signed on and ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So children are disrespected in every dimension. What can we do to advocate for gender diverse kids? I think education. That's why I wanted to emphasize what these kids go through. And so even if you are somebody in government or in the schools that has your own opinions that, I don't know, some prejudiced opinion, but you may still have a sense of justice and what's fair. And it's not fair that these kids go through this in their schools. with other kids. That children as a whole are exposed to such violence is just not okay in any way, shape, or form. So I think educating, letting people who have some power to do something know that this is what's going on. And the more you can get data from your own local setting. So if you wanted to impact a local school board, then you'd want to get data from your local school, which means you'd have to find allies within the school community who could ask kids, the school counselors, who could really find out information about this is what it means here. These practices are happening here, right where we live, and it's not right. It's not just, and that's why I was emphasizing portraying it not as an individual problem, which is what it all often comes down to. Oh, well, this kid. No, this is an issue of human rights. And portraying it that way.
How can we help kids who disclose to us, who are therapists, who are being bullied at school, and they're afraid to tell their parents or guidance counselors because they think that kids will retaliate?
Yeah. I think I would, as a therapist now, so looking at this as an individual issue, I would have that child develop a safety plan of how they can advocate for themselves and how they can become better at helping themselves remain safe so there's not more trauma. And then I'd want to find out from the child, who do you feel supported from here in this community, who in the school community? Do you have friends? Do you have people you can go to? Who have you talked to about this before? And you have to know enough as a therapist. You have to know people enough in the school community to don't recommend somebody that's going to reject the child. But you may know, a school counselor who would actually be sympathetic. And you might set up something with the child's permission to talk to that person, or the three of you on a phone call, or even a meeting. Do anything you can to provide the kids some social support for who they are, and helping them to develop better skills for keeping themselves safe. Because the bullies, there are probably other kids who are also being bullied by bullies. And then ultimately, the school community has to do something about bullying. It's just unacceptable. And it's still considered too normative. After all, that's what we just had a president, and that was his whole style that he conveyed. So that has to be undone. That has to be countered actively. You cannot allow any violence to occur in a school setting. And we have to define violence really broadly, because it may not just be physical bullying. It may be going on the internet. It may be going on just in things that are said and kids being laughed at. And teachers, adults are seeing that. The adults are seeing what's going on in the school, and they're letting it happen. And that has to be addressed at a higher level. The burden can't all be on the kid to do something.
Thank you, Sandra. Absolutely, totally agree. So just being cognizant of time, we'll have one more question and then we'll take our break. So Cynthia, thank you for posting. Cynthia asks, how do we contend with the different cultural, ethnic understanding of gender?
Yeah. I don't have an easy answer to that one. I think again, how do we change we've just gone through or are going through a period of trying to change attitudes towards race, which, by the way, is a myth. There is no such thing biologically as race in the human species. But we've been going through a period of trying to change those attitudes and belief systems, particularly on the part of white people. So I don't think that's just about white people. I think there are other cultural and ethnic prejudices that profoundly affect gender diverse kids. And I don't know what we can do except educate, except talk, have conversations with people to say, yeah, but you're, so much, it's all social construction. And it becomes an ideology that people feel very strongly part of their identity, but it's still a social construct. And that with enough education and human relatedness, those social constructs can change. That's about all I can say about that one. That's a biggie.
It is. It is. Thank you, Sandra. We so appreciate you being here with us.
It is now my very great pleasure to introduce Dane Ray, our second keynote speaker. Dane, feel free to unmute yourself and share your slides. And we are so looking forward to hearing your presentation and then getting some Q&A time at the end.
Thank you for the acknowledgement with that. I am Dane Ray. I am a licensed graduate professional counselor serving clients in the state of Maryland. I am also a facilitator and trainer with the Transgender Training Institute, who's partnered with us today to be able to provide the content around integrative and affirming care supporting transgender and non-binary adolescents. So, what we will do today is just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the content. Similarly to how Dr. Sandra presented her presentation, I would like to situate mine very similarly. So understanding who you are as a person in the different intersections of identity and points of reality is going to be very, very important, not only in how we understand ourselves and that sense of self-awareness, but also in how we engage the world, because how the identities we hold actually do inform how we view the world and how we may interact with others around us. So a few points of my identity: person of African descent, and actually today is Nigerian Independence Day. So for those of you all who serve clients from the diaspora, definitely just be aware of what things might be important to them. I'm currently urban living, physically disabled or differently abled, and also neurodiverse. Often I am perceived as a man. I do not identify as such, often perceived as straight, but do not identify as such. And I also come to you with the privilege of higher education. So understanding kind of where you situate yourself with life experience is going to be very, very important in executing successful affirming integrative care. So as we're going into sort of our pieces, let's take a look at this wheel similarly as to Dr. Sandra's presentation. If you can find yourself, whether that be cultural, whether it be gender, lived experience, class, find yourself. Who are you? What identities do you hold? Because this training is situated within the larger context of anti-oppression work, focusing on transgender non-binary people's experience, it's going to be very important to understand where you're situated.
Hey, Dane, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you share your full slides? Are you able to do that?
Thank you for that. Yep, it's full screen. There we go. For this training, also want to, is this better?
Yes, so much better. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. For this training, I also want to acknowledge that there may be several different identities of people who are here, and also acknowledging the people who have come before us to make this work possible. So I definitely want to name off the bat Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined intersectionality and some of the work that was done around it, because that's what we're really going to be talking about throughout. There may be also people in this training who have loved ones and or significant others and clients that are of the community. So we want to honor that your presence here with us today. And also we see you, we welcome you to participate and share as you are comfortable. But if at any point in time we're sharing statistics, we're sharing life experiences, if you need to opt out to take care of yourself, please do so. Objectives from my portion will be to understand that we as individuals really are in control as to how we are able to affirm others. Secondly, we must be self-aware in our own privileges and identities to better understand the intersectional impact for trans and non-binary people. We may continue growing, correcting, sharing ways to be more affirming and inclusive to transgender and non-binary peers or clients. The points that we're going to hit today will be around sharing, building shared knowledge, understanding lived experiences, then affirming actions. So around building shared language, what is affirmation? What is being affirming? So it's to declare a belief that something is valid or true, to provide emotional support or encouragement, or just simply the action or the process of being affirming. Now, to be trans affirming is believing that a person's gender identity is valid and true, putting aside your suppositions, putting aside any judgment, putting aside any ideals that may stand in the way of someone actually being able to live fully as who they are. That's what it means to be trans affirming. Also providing an emotional support for trans and gender diverse individuals, and also the collective actions and the process that a person's gender is always respected and honored. So we're looking at more than just the interpersonal relationships. We also have to address systems that may inhibit or create barriers for trans affirming care. To frame additional language, we're going to be using Dr. Eli Green's SIEO model. And the SIEO model stands for sex, identity, gender expression, and orientation. So the S is for sex, and sex is defined as a person's unique combination of genitals, chromosomes, and hormones. Many times within the healthcare medical community, it's often relegated by a medical professional at the time of birth, but sex as a whole constitutes more than just genitalia. Sex is the combination of someone's genitals, chromosomes, and hormones. Oftentimes, when we think about a sex designation at birth, we typically default, especially in the Western world, in America or the United States, North America, we think about male and female identities. However, there also are intersex identities. Intersex refers to a different combination of genitals, chromosomes, and hormones than we would typically expect from male or female combinations. And to quantify that for us a little bit, about 1.7% of the global population is or could be considered intersex, and that is about the same percentage as natural redheads. So if we're looking for a scalable number, that's not drawing a line between redheads and intersex status, but I just want to be able to let us know that if we've seen a redhead, we may have encountered someone who, without their knowledge or unbeknownst to them, may be or could be considered intersex. And also drawing the line that intersex is different from being transgender or being non-binary. Once again, it's a characteristic and a sort of a pocket that includes the categories and the diversity of the combination of genitals, chromosomes, and hormones. So that's what we mean when we're talking about sex. We're talking about the whole kit and caboodle, all the components. So I'm a visual learner, and so I wanted to offer this with you all today, that there are these three separate categories. So when we're talking about genitals, we're talking about things that can be included would be like penis, testicle, scrotum, clitoris, vulva, and uterus, just for examples. And then for chromosomes, although there are many more chromosomal types and iterations, some examples are XXXY, XXY, XXYY, XXXY, and plus many more. Then for hormones, the three top hormones that we typically would expect to find in someone who is just born would be testosterone, estrogen, or progesterone. So you take any combination of these, and that's how you're able to determine or to come up with someone's sex or sex traits. Last comment, I do want to mention that for people who were deemed intersex or were essentially categorized as intersex, oftentimes there are unsolicited and unconsensual surgeries that happen on intersex bodies at an early time, most often at the time of birth. The consideration here is that because those are non-consensual, they may have developmental implications down the line. So the intersex community wants us to be aware that this may happen and the implications that we need to be aware of as practitioners and people of the healthcare and medical communities to be able to better advocate for intersex identities and what their needs might be. So here are just a couple of resources and organizations that really drive that point home. So for sex assigned at birth, when we're talking about a sex assigned at birth, we're talking about simply the sex marker that was selected at the time of birth or recorded on the birth certificate if a birth certificate was provided. So next up, we're moving to the I now. The I of the SIEO model is gender identity and how a person experiences their gender in their mind, heart, body, and soul. Some examples of a gender identity can be man, woman, non-binary, agender, genderqueer, and pangender. You will hear a lot of terms throughout the rest of our presentation, and the goal is not to commit to memory, but the idea to sort of deprogram our mind to be less binary and more inclusive as to the clients and the people that we might meet in our daily practice. So gender identity is how a person experiences their gender in their heart, mind, body, and soul. And we've got different categories. So as we can see the umbrella here, we have transgender people, and it's a person whose gender identity is not congruent with whatever the assignment at birth was. So for non-binary people, it is a person whose gender identity doesn't easily fit into the boxes of male or female. Another note is that not all binary people consider themselves transgender. However, if we picture sort of gender as a table, people there at the gender table, there is a seat for non-binary people. So some non-binary people may consider themselves to be transgender, but they do not necessarily have to sit at that seat, but there is a seat at the table for those folks who identify that way. Along with gender identity, so to really provide that separation of understanding, the assignment at birth, if it's congruent and your gender identity is man, then that essentially would mean that you have a conforming identity. So someone who is assigned male at birth who identifies as a man, or someone who is female assigned at birth and identifies as a woman, that's considered gender conforming. And for people who may not agree and not feel at home with their assignment at birth, their gender identity may be different. So for someone who was assigned male at birth who identifies as a woman, someone who was assigned female at birth and identifies as a man, they may consider themselves transgender. So that's what we're talking about. The assignment at birth and identity are independent. However, they both constitute parts of someone's identity. So for non-binary people, regardless of whatever the assignment was at birth, male, female, or intersex, someone can determine to be non-binary. Someone may identify as non-binary, and that is independent of assignment at birth. We talked a little bit about development too, and so I just want to drive home the point that there is no one age or stage that everyone becomes aware of their gender identity. However, we are able to track it through being able to be open to cues and being able to be astute to whatever the needs are for that person. The E on the SIEO model is for expression. This would indicate essentially how a person communicates or expresses who they are to the world around them. I do want to also acknowledge that not everyone has access to commodities and being able to afford extra things that might be able to further clarify or express who they are. And so class can be a barrier for some folks in their gender expression. Gender expression also is explicitly external. Everything else must be shared by the youth, by the adolescent, for us to know. So there is separate terminology that can be used for gender expression. You might use terms like masculine, feminine, non-conforming, or gender diverse to express expression, to be able to have language around gender expression. What we're seeing with our eyes, what we're understanding around the world around us from what someone's trying to communicate to us about their gender. For folks who are non-conforming, the most important thing to recognize on this slide is regardless of assignment at birth or identity, your expression can be whichever and however you present. So there isn't necessarily a direct line to be drawn with an assignment to expression or identity to expression. And so for folks who are non-conforming, there isn't a line on the binary, or there isn't a line towards what someone may see on the outside. It may be different. The O is orientation, and this describes whom a person is either sexually, physically, romantically attracted to. And some people are attracted to people of a particular gender. Others are attracted to people of more than one gender. Some are not attracted to anyone. The important note around orientation, which may or may not come up with adolescents, is that you are able to have a fully autonomous orientation, whether or not you're in connection or in a relationship at all. So for instance, whether someone calls themselves lesbian or gay or bisexual, they would be that orientation and self-identify with that orientation, whether or not they're in an active relationship or connection with another human. So you're able to sort of have an autonomous orientation, and that's something to really be thoughtful about as we're helping with gender identity development with increased sense of affirmation for our youth. Orientation, once again, is who someone is physically, psychologically, sexually, or romantically attracted to, or who someone may want to be in a relationship if they want to be in a relationship at all. Here are some examples. I will highlight just a couple of the orientations here. One being that gay has been used as a large umbrella political kind of caveat to be able to achieve a larger goals for the LGBTQ community. So even though someone may be essentially lesbian identified, there may be times or ways that it shows up under the gay umbrella to achieve any kind of specific needs that they might have. The other term I wanted to highlight was queer. So queer is a personal identity, but it can also be an orientation depending on who you might engage with or have connection with across the spectrum. So I wanted to make sure that we understand by using the word queer, it also has a historical context, whereas maybe 2 or 3, 4 decades ago really had a visceral sense of displacement, relegation of what was expected, and there was a sense of slander by using the word queer. However, in present day, so you may get your Zennials or your younger generation who have reclaimed that as a sense of autonomy and freedom. So really be cautious as to leading with the term queer. However, if that is a term that the client uses, what you would want to do is be considerate and intentional about whether that's an identity term for them or whether that's an orientation term. Is that how they're linking and connecting to the world around them and others? Is that a sense of self and how they view themselves in the world? So that would be where we would want to understand and ask more questions and get very curious as to that part of their identity. Now we're going to move towards understanding lived experiences of transgender and non-binary individuals. So the first thing we have is the social part of a transition can be considered one aspect, and there are several different pockets of what a transition can look like. And I really wanted to take time today to help us conceptualize how a transition can be presented to us. So a social transition is one's process of making labels and appearance congruent with an identity. Social affirmation is having others acknowledge and respect one's identity and how they express them. There is also a potential legal component to a transition. It's the process of making one's legal identification and document congruent with your reality and identity. A legal affirmation is having your pronouns, gender marker, and name on your identification documents consistently and updated to affirm and to be accurate to reflect who you are. Lastly, there is the medical bucket. And in the medical bucket of transition, it's the process of bringing your body into congruence with your identity, usually through help of a medical professional. And medical affirmation is having access to medical care to bring one's body in line with your identity. So once again, understanding that with that last section, legal, and with this section, medical, there are still class-based and financial barriers that many trans and non-binary youth may experience with not being able to have either the legal permission or support or access. So if I'm going to go back to actually the legal part here, is because if you're going through a legal transition, that would institute potentially several different agencies. So you might have vital records, you might have the State Department, you might have your local DMV or motor vehicle association, and then you might also have a separate department if you have just a non-driver's license ID. And so thinking about all the different components and moving pieces that either parents and or youth would have to engage in order to accomplish that affirmation, we really have to be cognizant of those barriers. And for people in social work and or counseling and the medical professional, we have to be really strong and intentional advocates to make sure that we can help them address those barriers. So here's another picture of what that might look like. So for social affirmation, some folks may choose an affirming name, affirming pronouns, affirming clothes, or affirming spaces. So this can even include virtual like Facebook groups. It can include following people on TikTok. And those are different ways that people can validate themselves in a social aspect. Some examples of medical affirmation, we talked about it a little bit before, pubertal suppression, and that would be for the younger folks. For other folks, or in addition, there might be a hormones or hormone replacement therapy that might be used to accomplish and supplement medical needs. Some examples of non-genital surgeries, we often don't think about these, would be like voice work. So that ends up increasing the range on the high or low end, depending on what your gender needs are or your outcome goals may be. So that is an example. Facial reconstruction surgery is another option. Botox, laser hair removal are all examples of medical but non-genital interventions that might be used, that we might see and need to help with for our adolescents. Lastly, in the legal affirmation category, we talked about a name change. We mentioned sex markers and identity documents, but also in the case of adoption or guardianship, we want to make sure that whatever is happening and whatever we have access to is supportive and reflective of an accurate identity for our adolescent. So now we're going to look at basically a picture and a story of a transgender youth. I do want to be as trauma focused and informed as possible. So in this particular video clip, there is talk of suicidality and ideation and self-harm. So I just wanted to make sure that we were aware of that. And if I could just get a nod on camera that you can hear the audio.
I cannot at least hear the audio. Can anybody else?
No, not yet, Dane.
Okay, here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to reshare. I apologize. I'm going to reshare and make sure that the sound is shared. Thank you for letting me know. Perfect. Let's start that over.
I'm the scary transgender person the media warned you about. I'm Rebecca.
My name is Jamie Briesehoff, and I am married. We have 3 children. They are 10, 8, and almost 3 years old. So I write a blog called I Am Totally That Mom. In the past few years, my blog has really become more focused on our journey with a transgender child. So Rebecca has always been gender nonconforming. As young as 2 or 3, she gravitated to typically feminine things. She loved pink and sparkles and all things girly, and that was fine with us.
This is a soft blanket that I have, and it says Benjamin on it, so we put it with my Benjamin box.
As her gender nonconformity intensified, we started to notice some distress around things like being grouped with boys at school or in activities. So by the time she was 7, all of this kind of hit a crisis point, and her anxiety was crippling, and her depression was becoming life-threatening, and we were at a loss.
There's a picture of me. I don't look so happy.
We were faced with a 7-year-old kid who wanted to die. One time she punched out the screen in her second-story window and tried to jump out.
The hardest part of all this was when I didn't transition and I was not happy and it didn't feel right.
So we sought the support of a gender specialist. And so through conversations there, Rebecca came to tell us, no, this is definitely me. I'm a girl. I'm a girl in my head and my heart.
I felt like I was a girl because I liked the color pink and I liked girls' clothes and how they wore their hair and stuff.
At the time, it was the happiest I'd ever seen her, frolicking through the girls section of the clothing store, picking out clothes and seeing what she liked. She was just a different kid. It was like a cloud lifted.
It feels good to have like a sister instead of a brother, since I already have a baby brother and I think a big brother would just be too much for me. When I see pictures of Ben, I just think of it as part of my past, and now I'm me.
When she told me, I didn't believe her. I was shocked and I was like, I don't believe you. That is not true.
Rebecca really doesn't like thinking about the medical side of it.
So thinking about families, thinking about sort of family systems and thinking about how we may need to deal with families and the different members of that system to be able to more heavily and accurately support the needs of trans and non-binary youth is going to be very, very important and integral to us being successful and affirming. I'm going to go back to full screen mode. Just bear with me one moment. So taking a look about the data, we talked about being a few data points and statistics. With transgender and non-binary youth, according to the United States Transgender Survey that came out just a few years ago, 24% of the respondents who were out or perceived as trans in college reported being verbally, physically, or sexually harassed at that time. So what things are in place? How are we watching and assessing for violence? One of the new things as a clinician that I've really become more cognizant of, and what are the empirically based resources that we have to assess for violence via telehealth. There are some huge challenges, and as many of us are not serving clients directly in person, or less more so than previously, really have to be more aware of harm that might come in the way, especially for adolescents or youth. 16% of the above group reported having left college due to harassment. So we're talking about watching for things like escapism or avoidance. We want to make sure that when we're talking to our clients and trans youth that we're watching for not only affect, but also proxemics. We'll pay attention to the mood, paying attention to behavior, paying attention to how they operate and use their space for cues of discomfort, dissatisfaction, safety, and wellness. Next, we have transgender students who are more likely to experience a hostile environment and have a lower sense of belonging as compared to cisgender and LGB peers. So there have been studies to specifically have the juxtaposition of LGBT people and trans and non-binary youth as well. And transgender students do experience, are likely to experience a more hostile environment with lower sense of belonging. Now, inside of that surveyed population, students of color and trans women were more likely to experience discrimination. So being aware of those points of privilege and oppression and points of identity that might help us better serve our community. How can we help? So once again, I want to reiterate, we do not have to fully understand all the neo-pronouns and all of the new terminology and all of the new data to better be supportive. We don't have to understand someone's identity to be respectful and supportive. The more respect that we actively show, the more we contribute to a safe and welcoming workplace and or environment for our youth. Here are 5 tips to be able to provide direct affirming actions. Do everything you can possible to avoid misgendering. So I wanted to highlight just some direct quotes from within the community that really highlight the impact of misgendering. So the first quote really just says about there being equity training and then the videos and pronouns, and that none of the professors or colleagues had ever asked what the pronouns are. So simply sharing yours and modeling that that provides a sense of equity. So for instance, I don't use pronouns, but if I'm in a space where I'm not sure of what pronouns people use, I might say, hey, I'm Dane Ray, I don't use pronouns, but what is your name and pronouns if you use them? Would be a great way to invite the conversation, allow people to sort of have that sense of equity and inclusion in the space. Lastly, from the community, someone who experienced misgendering, it's the flinching inwardly to those close to you, spotting it when you've been misgendered. Chronically painful is how they described it. It hurts, it haunts, and it causes huge sadness and discomfort. Pronouns are vitally important. So a study on youth showed that having their names and pronouns alone, just name and pronoun alone, respected and affirmed at home, school, and work, socially experienced fewer symptoms of severe depression, 34% drop in suicidal thoughts, and a 65% decrease in attempts. So our impact can actually start now. So affirming names and pronouns, they matter a lot. Here are some examples of the traditional pronouns that we would typically expect to see: she, her, they, them, and he, him. However, if you do see pronouns that you may be less familiar with, sie here, fey, fem, fairs, sie, them, you want to make sure that you're just listening and asking the questions to be able to make sure that you're being as affirming as possible. Now, missteps and mistakes may happen, but we're able to walk through them as long as we're able to try to meet the client, meet the person, meet that youth where they are, to be able to let them know that we're on the road to being able to be more affirming, we're on the road to learning, and that we don't have to sort of offload that burden of our experiential learning to them. We can do this. We can really do this by using gender neutral language. So we can do this from a systemic point of view with our policies that we roll out at the place we work, but we can also do it interpersonally in our engagements with adolescent clients. So this might look like minimizing the use of gendered language, which can help prevent misgendering. So how do we do that? What do we have to do? We can look at words like you. Instead of trying to guess or someone's pronouns and using those in place of a name, we could just say you. We can also say client or student, or if we're addressing a group, folks or y'all or everyone, or this person or this patient, this or friend. There are a lot of different ways, and I often suggest to use sort of the relationship in order to have an identifier as opposed to assuming someone's identity or pronouns. Here are just some best practices. What we want to do going forward is try to reprogram our brain. Instead of saying things like real sex or real gender or genital sex, we may want to just say sex assigned at birth. It could land as a lot more affirming. Instead of saying a transgender, we may want to look to say transgender person or person of trans experience. Instead of saying transgendered, you can just simply say transgender or transgender man or trans woman. Another thing that we may hear in the community, but we may want to steer away from, is using the acronyms of FTM, which has historically stand for female to male, or M to F, which has stood for male to female. This may be in community language that's used, but we wouldn't lead with this as professionals or clinicians. We would simply want to be able to call that client by their name and or identify a need. By using F to M or M to F, that simply draws a line straight back to either a process or part of the journey which they no longer identify. By saying transgender, you've kind of covered that person has had a diverse experience. There's no need to be able to trivialize it by saying M to F or F to M. Another sort of outdated term that we've been able to identify is hermaphrodite. That is a term that has been used in science and in medicine to describe non-human animals. So the language we would, diversity within non-human animals. But for humans specifically, we would definitely want to use the language of an intersex person if that's the case for that individual. And instead of saying sexual preference, we would want to say orientation. And I want to once again say that orientation is a little bit more than just who you're in relationship with. It's who you might have the propensity to be connected to. So you can have your orientation whether or not you're in a relationship or regardless of status. Affirming. How do we become affirming? So asking the question, what name, pronouns, or honorifics would feel best for me to use, but not just in the asking. If you can see below, I will also audibly say it, that you want to check in to make sure that the language or the words or the pronouns that you're using for this young one are appropriate to use with your coworkers or other administrators or parents. So if there's confidentiality and someone shared something with you, you really want to do that full consent, informed consent, to be able to say, hey, outside of this context, is this still appropriate? And making sure that the client and or the person you're serving has an understanding of where that information might be shared or how it might be used, in so much as to like mail delivery that might come to them for like insurance or medical notices. We want to make sure that they understand what might the impact using a name or the name that you are using might have on them. So just making sure that we always have that buy-in and we're on the same page with the language to be used that is most affirming. There are many, many ways to share pronouns. One of the ways is verbal, how we modeled earlier. Another one is a wearable. So in your practice, you can institute or provide buttons, pins, lanyards, stickers that provide a sense of visibility, affirmation, and inclusivity for people to articulate who they are. There is also a myriad of technology ways to integrate affirmation. So we can do this through email signatures. We can do this through social media, as any Facebook users out there, you know, that you can create Facebook filters, Facebook frames, which can help articulate, express, and affirm who you are. And even in our Zoom profile, as we can look at our hundreds of participants here, some people have their pronouns listed. So that is just another way that we can provide a little bit more equity in whatever spaces that we're occupying. Some other miscellaneous considerations for pronoun sharing are name placards, intake form, healthcare information systems, employment databases or HR systems, how the name is captured, what information is used, are all going to be considerations, because seeing and sharing pronouns can encourage other people to do the same. It creates a culture where people will feel safe. So increasing safety will allow other people to share their pronouns as well. Another tip, so 2 out of 5, the second tip would be apologize if you slip up. Missteps might happen, but it's really, really good to apologize. So I've conceptualized how to do an apology through ABCs. A is for apologize and acknowledge. I misspoke. That is my fault. I apologize. I did not mean to say that. Be attentive and responsive. So no victim blaming. Well, you just changed your name 6 months ago. I'm still getting used to this. I'm sure every one of us can identify someone that we've experienced getting married. And if a name has changed, we make that adjustment once we're told. So we want to have the same respect for our adolescents and youth. And we want to be attentive and responsive. So we don't want to place blame and or shame for people who have really fought so hard, as we can see through our journey of this presentation, of coming into who they are. So being attentive and responsive is a great way to actively apologize. Then for C, to correct and adjust. To acknowledge and to be attentive without correcting or adjusting would be mute. So we want to correct, adjust, and consider the correction. If you've been updated, if someone says, I don't use those pronouns, then you say, oh, thank you for letting me know. We want to thank them because that correction is a gift. Now we've got more information to be able to provide a higher level of care. So there are 6 common slip-ups that happen as it relates to pronouns. So sometimes we slip up when we're unsure. Sometimes we mess up when we have missed the memo. So maybe another colleague, coworker, or intake has the information, but that didn't translate to us. It kind of didn't filter through the pipeline. And so there's correction that needs to happen as a result of not getting all the updated information. There also can be harm that could be caused by not updating or practicing. So it's really a barrier if we're not practicing other pronouns or pronouns that we're hearing, then it may not be at the forefront of our mind and mistakes may happen. Oftentimes, if you have a prior relationship with someone, you may make pronoun slips because of the prior relationship or that relationship history. We want to be cognizant of those scenarios. If you mess up and then you realize it after the fact, so amidst a meeting or in session, you realize, oh my goodness, I totally didn't fully affirm that person, or I made a complete direct misstep. That often is a pronoun slip when things happen. And then also when someone else is messed up. So we're observing someone else misgender someone or someone else use an incorrect name. We want to be able to recover from those types of scenarios to be able to help us better understand how we can be more affirming. So as it relates to recovery, we want to correct yourself in the moment. So you don't necessarily have to wait. You're able to correct yourself in the moment, whether or not you do so audibly or verbally. We can also go back when appropriate to apologize. We can send a text or an email, but the most important thing is accountability. Apologizing to all present. A lot of times we want our apology to be relegated directly towards the person we've harmed, but we're also modeling either good or bad behavior all the time. Everything we do is therapeutic. So we want to be cognizant of making sure that we've let others know that this isn't acceptable. This isn't my typical self. And so we want to make sure that we're apologizing to anyone else around us that may have heard the harm or been around to experience the harm. We also want to do a pronoun check. So if you've not seen someone, we've been amidst a health crisis for quite a while now. And so some folks we might not seen. And so we want to make sure that we check in with folks to make sure that the language and the words that we're using are still relevant. Checking in with a misgendered person. So you may want to check in with them directly to make sure that you get that update, but also making sure that any additional information that you might need in the way of feedback or grievances is heard and felt. Lastly, we want to make sure that we are able to, if it happens, call in the person who might be doing the harm. So that's if we observe harm happening. We want to avoid burden shifting. Common errors when apologizing or for misgendering are trying to explain why. We're trying to just demonstrate positive intentions. I didn't mean it. I know better. I'm such a bad person. Would you like a Starbucks gift card? None of that fully heals and allows us to recover. So we want to avoid the burden shifting. We want to just take responsibility and apologize and move on. Four, treating disclosures as a gift. So thank you for trusting me is a way we could frame it. Thank you for trusting me with this information. Is there anything else that you would like for me to know? Is there any particular way that I can support you? This can be phenomenal as it relates to like family and peer dynamics at school. We can really ask, how else can I support you? Is there any area that you feel like you might need a little bit of assistance or a champion or an advocate? So we want to ask more than just, oh, thanks for letting me know. We want to make sure that we also say, are there any other ways that I could be helpful for you? We do want to avoid commentary and compliments. So commentary would be, an example of commentary would be like, oh, I have a trans friend, or my roommate from college has, a spouse who is transgender, and all the tangential conversation. That's not as helpful and doesn't land as affirming as probably we would hope. So even if it's well-intentioned, it's more likely to land as a microaggression. Something else that you might want to say to frame conversation is, I want to respect and support your boundaries. How would you like for me to navigate your name or pronouns with different agencies, different people? And so we want to get a clear understanding of who and where is acceptable to use those pronouns and or name. Clear communication is essential. You want to make sure that we establish clear communication and we're getting that buy-in from the client to be able to inform us as to the direction that we take. We're not going to take steps on our own. We're going to get that information as informed by the client to increase safety. So it's for that specific purpose. So a young person may not have all the answers and all the language, and they may need time and context to think about the questions before responding. So just acknowledging that developmentally, they may need time to process, figuring out who they are. They may not have language or words. Then lastly, pay attention to what's happening. If someone shares pronouns and or their gender with you, use what they give you. Use what they give you. This would help to underscore the difference between survival and thriving. So when I think about survival is often reactive, largely reactive. So managing missteps after harm has occurred, whereas thriving can be proactive if utilized the right way. So in thriving, developing transparency and or protocols before harm has occurred. So when we talked about the recovery options, that's a way to thrive and be proactive in your approach and have sort of a system in place to be able to manage through the things that where we might fall short. Some of the things with surviving to watch for would be with our clients would be like misgendering. If a client experiences like side comments or gossip, microaggressions, you're so young, do you really know who you are yet? Those things, to be able to trivialize or infantilize somebody's experience, and developmentally, they really can articulate who they are. It would be a microaggression if we're to use that power dynamic in an abusive way. Social isolation can also be a really key indicator of someone's inability to survive. So if we're able to provide more support, more community, and normalization around and in their life, that can really be an indicator of survival. Also watching for things like bullying. Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned watching for affect and mood changes in addition to how a youth and or adolescent operates and utilizes their space. We want to be able to watch for those pieces to be able to inform what's happening in their world. So actions are paying close attention, listening, and correct misgendering when it happens, model messing up so that you can show them this is how we're able to recover, to be you're the best example that they might have access to. So name the microaggressions, making the connection so that there can be trust and safety. An example of something else that can be done is saying, hey, I noticed that you are wringing your hands, you seemed a little closed off, your eye contact is very low, so I want to ensure that you feel safe and comfortable. Just checking in and acknowledging any discomfort. Acknowledging the hypervigilance may not be just because of a power dynamic, but it's because of what they're experiencing in their own internal world. So just naming what you're noticing, bringing the client in with that process to let them know that you want to be with them in that moment can be very helpful. These practices are essential, even when we assume that the transgender or non-binary person is not present with us in the space. We can still implement these if we're not directly in front of the person. To thrive, we want to build a culture of mutual support. develop the culture that reduces the labor and burden on transgender people and or non-binary youth for trying to accomplish and achieve whatever their rights are. We also want to create a listening culture. So what processes do you have in place to receive feedback? That's something that I want us to take away from our conversation today. Create a listening culture. How are you receiving feedback? And is your feedback when something's asked or when you receive feedback, are you receiving it in an open and non-defensive way? Many of these tips were found through the Harvard Business Review, which was just released last year. So that is obviously a public resource that you all can look at to be able to help make sure that some of the processes that you have are leaning towards allowing our clients to thrive and be resilient. So supporting transgender and non-binary youth, believe them, validate and emphasize who they are, use affirming name and pronouns, help connect to support and resources. Huge, huge, huge. Whether it's peers, whether it's community groups, connect them to resources. Advocate for them within your profession, but also around your community, and be proactive. Recognize that the need to affirm one's gender identity can supersede other critical concerns. We discussed earlier, someone may come presenting with a lot of different or several different diagnoses. So we want to really take each day as a unique and individual one so that we can isolate whatever the immediate and most critical area of concern is. Realizing that some folks may have had negative experiences in the past and may perceive slights even when not intended. So it may not be you. It may just be their life experience with authority, with the medical industrial complex. It really could be the reason why there might be disdain or separation or hypervigilance or mistrust. We want to avoid asking questions out of curiosity. So let's try to stick to asking only what we need to know. There is no litmus test. It is a step-by-step process because each client is unique. Supporting transgender and non-binary youth. So identify and create LGBT-related school resources and or community resources. Identify ways to learn about transgender, non-binary gender identities to incorporate into your workplace, your processes, or curriculum if you have it. LGBTQ centers or groups on campus, the word I will say about LGBTQ centers and groups, make sure it's relevant for your client. So just because your client is trans or non-binary does not necessarily mean that the local LGBTQ center is the best fit for them. Think about race, culture, class, language, and accessibility. All of those could make maybe that local community center not the best fit. We just want to make sure we audit ourselves as we're resource sharing, that the resources that we're providing to our families and to our adolescents is appropriate. Here are 5 steps that you can do. Learn about trans and non-binary people's lives. Also share what you learn. Share the knowledge because we're all here because we want to learn. How powerful would it be if you were able to leverage that visibility to your own personal network? Then just the interpersonal use of affirming names and pronouns. Be kind and friendly. Interrupt prejudice. Observe and advocate. We want to do things like non-judgmental responses, asking and modeling for pronouns, navigating shifts in names. We want to address that confidentiality, complications in confidentiality about letting even the young ones know, hey, well, if you're using this name, is it okay if I use it in this scenario? And then thinking beyond their identity, because identity is just one piece. And we want to make sure that we want to think beyond the scope. We want to think about safety. We want to think about wellness, anything that's sustainable. When we're receiving feedback, so those are just the examples of what I just stated. So as an example, a practice and affirmation. So there's an example of Jay. So, hey, Jay, if I ever hear someone use the incorrect pronouns for you when you aren't around, should I, and fill in the blank. This isn't a way for you to be able to say, well, I'm not sure if I was supposed to say anything. Is that my place? Was that the expectation that me as an ally or as a cisgender person, am I supposed to speak up or say something? So that's something that you want to be aware of, is to be able to have that conversation and saying, hey, I'm in a position mentally, physically to help, but what would be helpful for you? So you want to get how you help as an ally or as a practitioner informed by your client. Next, just a few barriers that we want to be aware of. So with bathrooms, having non-gender bathrooms is going to be very, very, very foundational to equity in spaces. And we're not just talking about having non-gender bathrooms alone. Also list what the facilities have so that folks can know what's inside and what they can use and what they have access to. Calling out or calling in disrespect, microaggressions, slander, and prejudice. Model by using your own identity and pronouns if you use them. Continue learning and growing. My hope is that all of us will find the space and energy and time to be able to kind of continue to read up and to be able to update our skill sets around this work. Lastly, you can also follow 3 non-binary and trans activists on social media. Keep yourself relevant, share their content, inform yourself. So here are 3 examples. And look is a wonderful, wonderful example of just someone who's in the community, an influencer in the community. Zaya is a child. She is the child of a basketball player who has had a very public transition. And so a lot of our younger clients may be aware of Zaya and her transition. And then we have an actor, India, who uses they, them pronouns and identifies as non-binary. So the reason why I used these examples is because there was less of a conflation between the pronoun someone uses and their gender identity. So as you can see, Look is actually gender nonconforming. Zaya identifies as a girl, and India actually identifies as non-binary. And so I wanted to make sure that we understand there's so much diversity with it. That's why we have to treat everyone as an individual. But these are a great starting point for us to be able to find sort of context and a look into the community. So in summary, we as individuals are in control of how we are able to affirm others. We must be self-aware of our own privileges and identities to better understand the intersectional impact for trans and non-binary peers and young ones. We want to continue growing, correcting, and sharing ways to be more affirming and inclusive to transgender and non-binary peers. Thank you so much for your attention today. I will stand by for any comments and further direction. I really appreciate your time, and I hope that we're all able to create a more equitable world. And also, as a note, if there are any questions that you may not want to ask directly through chat or in this moment, and you come up with questions later, I do provide my email address. It's just dane@transgendertraininginstitute.com. Thank you all again.
Thank you so much, Dane. So Dane, one of the questions posted, what are some ways to support parents in overcoming fears around medical transition for their own kids?
Wow. So personally and professionally, I have all the feelings about this question. What I will share is be really curious about what the parents' experiences, what were the first experiences that you had with your child? Let's walk down, and even though I'm not a psychoanalytic clinician, we want to have that approach. Like, what was birth like? What was kindergarten? What was pre-K like? You can ask these questions to be able to walk with your client empathetically, right? Or a parent empathetically about this change. And sort of the resistance, like that really stringent resistance to that change, especially it relates to like medical interventions. You really want to just be empathetic and find out where the distress is coming from. In addition, to speak specifically to people who may want to seek, for instance, pubertal suppression, you want to do some psychoeducation. Because pubertal suppression is essentially a pause button. So it allows the youth to have puberty in tandem with their peers, so they won't have to be 37 or 40 going through a second puberty. It serves as a pause button so that those second sex characteristics don't develop, and they're able to have one puberty. I am sure if we did a hand raise here, there probably wouldn't be the majority of people wanting to go through puberty again. So pubertal suppression allows the child to sidestep a lot of those developmental social distress around puberty, around that stage. But I also would tell that parent that if the child decides that that medication is no longer necessary, that hormone replacement therapy is no longer necessary, the pubertal suppression would be removed and their secondary characteristics would then develop as naturally occurring. So there will be no disruption to any neurological and or developmental implications as far as I can. And I'm not an endocrinologist, so I want to really clearly make that disclaimer, but I want to put that in context. I would share with a client that once you stop it, then that's going to essentially matriculate through the process naturally.
Thank you. Thank you. Very helpful. Another question, is using the term gender affirming surgery still appropriate, or should we stick to medical transition?
That's also a great question, especially if you're doing letter writing. So what I would try to do is, if that's the context, right? You're writing something down, I would try to get some context from my client as to the implication of whatever language you're using. So gender affirming care could maybe be a whole gamut of like laser surgery, and it could be facial reconstruction and this and voice work. That's still gender affirming care, but it's not necessarily surgical. So making sure that we make the delineation between the types of services available, which is why I highlighted a few of non-genital surgery so that we know they can have access to them by using the more inclusive terms. However, if the adolescent really wants to clarify that this is the thing that I need, and that's literally a bilateral mastectomy or any kind of oophorectomy or any kind of like bottom work, then you would be able to identify that specifically, because what we want to do is make sure that the language you're using is congruent to the need. So that's what I would use as our benchmark. But once again, largely gender affirming care would be the umbrella term for any legal, medical, or social affirmation or changes that we're using to address to bring them more congruent into their identity.
Great.
I hope that answers the question.
So much, Dane.
So Dane, thank you so much for your amazing training this afternoon. One of the questions was, when working in a medical setting, insurance companies require sex to be included in order for agencies to submit payment, especially around medications. Suggestions on how to be affirming within a system that continues to uphold the false binary.
It shocks me how many of us workers, healthcare workers, and helping professionals really intrinsically have the answers. And I love the answer that you gave. We are amidst pushing against a system that is designed to really be binary and not affirm diversity. And so we want to acknowledge and name that, even to like a 5 or 6 year old. We want to say, hey, what happens is if you change this M to an F or this F to an M, when we report, you may no longer have access to have these surgeries. So for instance, if you have your marker change from an F to an M, any kind of gynecological care may be less likely to be accessible to you. Explaining this is going to be very important, and I believe that that might be one of the most affirming ways to be able to meet them where they are, to address the issue, so that it's, one, not a surprise, so we can really decrease that harm in advance by naming the barriers and allowing, then when we name that, we're giving the autonomy back to the client. They have autonomy to be able to name and figure out what direction they might have, because their answer might be, hey, we'll cross that bridge when we get there, and they might say, oh, you know what, never mind, stopgap. we're gonna put that on pause. And there's nothing wrong with taking your time and making your journey your own. Many of us have clients that look to us for labels. I feel different. Am I trans? I feel different. I need a name for it. Well, I don't feel like a boy. I don't feel like a girl. I feel like this. And so they're really looking for labels, spouses and families included. My spouse transitioned, so I need a label. We want to be able to walk them back to a person-centered approach to be able to say, hey, where does that desire for a label come from? And or once you've accepted a label, if you choose a label, What can we do to affirm that? And so if through accessing, medical care, through being able to understand the nuances of insurance, that's part of the job. Everything we do is therapeutic. I can't understate that. And so being able to sort of let them know that those are barriers and being allowed to make the choice. And if there's anything that's unexpected along the way, say, oh, we didn't expect that. How are we going to manage that? And you go right back to treatment plan. You go right back to managing the distress and tolerance. You go back to all those tenets.
Thank you. So from an anonymous attendee, the question is, I have heard of some parents who are very fearful about, quote, rapid onset gender dysphoria. I know this is not a medical diagnosis, but how do we talk with parents who state their children are experiencing this? And how do we talk with parents who believe it's strictly the result of peer pressure / social media? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I would allow my client and their experience and to affirm whatever direction they're going. That is the most clear, succinct way that I can answer. So if a client is having reservation about what they are experiencing and or what is materialized for them, we can always pivot. That's what we're here for. We're able to pivot. We're able to support them through any changes, life changes, and growth, through any stage of development. So my recommendation would be, hey, if there are regret has not been empirically proven at a high level, that there's a large sense of regret for people who have insistent, persistent, and consistent desire or expression of who they are. So because the data is not there to substantiate high pervasive levels of regret, I would explore what else the client might be needing, because there might be something missing. A common example, though, would be like, hey, a surgery that doesn't have the results that we want. My hope is that clinician would have maybe talked about what happens if your surgery doesn't turn out the way you want. If anyone's watched the documentary Cured, you'd see like being under sort of the surgical, being on the surgical table, there have been sort of active prejudice acted out on bodies. And so with that being said, someone may wake up and it's not what they expected. How do we manage through that? Where's the reciprocity? Where's the justice? And who do we need to employ to be able to support the client going forward? What might the client need? Does the client need a prior authorization for an additional surgery? Does the client need immediate critical care? What might be needed to support that client if there is a sense of, hey, now I don't like where I am and what's showing up? We have to move from that point and not before it. We have to move right from that moment.
Thank you, Dane. And if someone is non-binary, does that mean that they are asexual?
No. There are many different reasons why someone may identify as an asexual person. So someone may just have a bout of 5-10 years where they're just, I'm just focused on career, was grad school, now I'm in a PhD. I just don't really, this isn't a priority for me. And so they may or may not identify as asexual. Someone's gender identity is not to be conflated with orientation. However, there may be someone out there who is both non-binary and asexual. Anybody of any identity may be asexual. And a person of non-binary status, speaking of orientation, can also be bisexual. So they might, for instance, date non-binary people and men, or non-binary people and women, or they might date people who identify as queer and also other non-binary people. So we want to make sure that we are drawing the right lines between orientation and gender. But no, there is no line between someone who is asexual, which is a propensity towards being in a personal, physical, romantic relationship, a lower propensity to be in one of those relationships or connection or connectedness with someone, versus someone who just does not identify as male or female. That would be the distinction.
Thank you. And another question, how can we be affirming without legal issues? I'm not exactly sure what that means, but you may understand.
So I'm going to take a guess, and whoever asked that question, definitely clarify in the chat so someone can read that to me, any clarification. So what we're saying is, hey, I want this, but my documents may not allow me to have that. And how do we navigate when things aren't lined up? By either A, setting the expectation, or B, advocating so that those gaps and changes can be corrected.
Excellent. And how can you support kids/young adults of parents who have recently identified as non-binary?
Local support groups, once again, I heavily suggest that we audit and make sure that we kind of call, check frequency, check how many people, like ask the questions about the populations that attend, because support groups are very, very, very great for families. So if there is a child who has a parent who now is kind of in the world, living in the world differently than what they previously had experienced, it's going to be very, 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 very important that they have a sense of support, not just for normalization, but as a cathartic outlet to be able to let them know and ground them in who they are, independent of a parent's identity. So I would strongly suggest like lower levels of care and or support groups for that.
And one of our attendees asks, do you have any information in regards to star gender? I've run a kiddos group before and someone shared this in the group. Could you provide some insight?
Unfortunately, I don't. I try to be as transparent as possible. I'm not very familiar with the star gender, but what I can do is I can work with HRSA in Westchester University about finding resources so they can send it in a wrap-up email if that would be appropriate.
Thank you, Dane. How can I support someone who identifies as demisexual?
Curiosity. And not curiosity as in tell me all the things about you, but curiosity as to what that means for them. Not only internally, what are they experiencing, but how does that, the touch points of how they experience life. Because if we're able to have a deep understanding about how they're experiencing their life based off of the identity that they're expressing, then we want to be able to meet them right there. And so that's what I would say. It would be the same thing for any other identity, is being able to help them find language to further identify what is true for them. That's going to be the most helpful thing, because then it's going to help expand that locus of control. Because if I understand who I am, then I might then be able to better quantify my needs. And then when I'm able to understand my needs, thinking my Maslow hierarchy, then I'm also able to then more confidently institute my boundaries. And how liberating would that be for a young person to be able to have very clear and distinct boundaries based off of understanding who they are? That's my recommendation.
Just solid recommendations. How can I support my client who identifies as lesbian and is dating someone who is bisexual, but has recently told my client that she is asexual? The client believes sex is important in her relationship.
That sounds like more of a case. I'm just using my clinical judgment here that really I would use peer supervision or group supervision to really discuss the nuances of that case, because there's no way I could speak to the different dynamics of each party, right? So the person who identifies as asexual and then the person who has distinct and expressed needs, and that's changed. That's the thing that on a cursory level that I would address, that there's been a change. There's been a shift. You're not getting what you used to get. Things look different now. But to fully, really more adequately address that relationship dynamic and its total wellness, I would definitely that's a great one for a group supervision or peer supervision. And or if you have colleagues who you know are competent, trustworthy, ethical, try to see if you can get some context as to navigating through identities, sexual development and needs, and how intimacy can look. There's so many different ways to tap into intimacy and to be able to get your needs accomplished without a direct separation or a visceral response against a partner.
Dane, I just have to thank you so much for your generosity of spirit and holding space. The chat is flooded with all of these like kudos and compliments and just great gratitude for, just your real generous approach to this topic. And I guess finally, as we're getting close to our break, what I'd love for you to do, because you chose the segment of the Frontline video that we're going to watch following the break, which is going to be one of 2 videos that the panel will have an opportunity to see with everybody else and react to. I'm wondering if you could help us by characterizing that video and just describing a little bit about what we can expect.
Wow, thank you for that. First, I would like to say, chose this video because it deals with a family. I also chose this video because it was dealing immediately with the issues of the social struggle of affirmation, the medical struggle of affirmation, and legal. So we're dealing with a transgender teen who's on the precipice of independence and adulthood, but can't quite make the decisions legally by themselves now. So now we've added on a layer of power dynamic. And so there's a perception of something is standing in the way for me being able to be whole and happy. And that thing is my parents. But we add another layer on, and the parents are completely polar opposites with how they engage with their youth. And so watching this as a healthcare professional, really looking at those different pieces, right? Dad's influence, mom's influence, then picturing the youth as your client. And another component to this is potential or pending divorce. And the reason why I named that is we named in the presentation that there may be other issues that present. And so much of the relationship dynamic between the parents, the youth has internalized. They've internalized the strife, the disconnection, and the distaste of one parent, and sort of internalized that the divorce is their fault. And so imagine what they're doing with the energy and pain that they're experiencing. And so I feel like this clip really helps us paint the picture of an experience internally, gives us sort of an inside look as to a family and the struggles that they go through. And everyone has sort of a different vantage point. Now, as a clinician, we've got to take all of that into account, but we want to make sure that we're advocating for inclusivity, we're advocating for affirmation. So that sort of is just a cursory understanding of the video. And no matter what your profession is, no matter what your specialty is, try to envision if this was your client. Try to envision what steps would you put in place? Who would you employ to be able to be a helper along with you? What supportive services might they need? How would you introduce those supportive services? Would this client have the support of the parents to be able to engage in those supportive services? So those are the questions that you would ask if this was your client. And so that's the mindset I want to also all put on the hat. If this is a client that you're helping, treating, taking care of, responsible for, how would we navigate that?
Excellent. We are grateful, Dane. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation.
Online is a great place for trans people. The internet is the best place you can go to if you're like scared about talking to anyone. The internet, like Tumblr, oh my God, Tumblr. And just YouTube too. YouTube is like that's how I found out I was trans, is from a YouTube video that I found a long time ago.
Kyle met his friend John in a support group for transgender teens. The online world has helped them learn to pass as guys, even without testosterone.
When I officially came out as trans, yeah, it took my parents a long time, and my dad is still having his issues with it.
It seems super hard for dads, though. It seems a lot because it's like, oh, daddy's girl, that thing. Did that ever happen to you?
I don't feel like that's what was up with my dad. I don't think it was a daddy's girl kind of thing. I think it was, I think it's just hard for him to imagine, like, being able to be born one way and identify as another. I think he's just, guys aren't really allowed to play with their gender at all.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that was more about what it's hard for him to wrap his head around.
birth name was Gianna. For as long as I can remember, I always felt male. I did come out to my parents as a lesbian sometime around 7th, maybe. You know, I thought, oh, well, I seem to wear boys' clothes all the time. I feel masculine, and I realized that I like girls, so I was like, okay, I must be a lesbian. That was tough. My dad, he just wouldn't have any part of it. I think he said something to me. He said, this is not a world that you're gonna be a part of. Then, when I got to my freshman year, I identified as trans, so I came out to them again as a trans male.
At that point, I was using pronouns she and her, and he said, Mom, you know, when you say that, when you say she, it feels like I'm actually naked and I feel horrible and I just want to disappear. So I started to say G, and now he would like to be called John, so I just go between both names still. It's still getting used to the process of the name.
So it's still G to me. Certainly not the Gianna from, you know, childhood, but it's still G, and I haven't switched over to the John. It's a little harder for me. I mean, I feel in a sense like something's been robbed, right? Like, you know, so my daughter's gone, it seems, and is morphing into this other person, but I feel like this may be where it ends up. I don't know, I hope not, but I think there's another way. There's a whole spiritual side to this to me, so I pray a lot, and you know, and the whole spiritual piece of this is, you know, I just don't believe that this is the right way to go. This is a personal place that I'm at. I want G happy. I want, you know, the best life for her. You know, want that life based in, how do I put this? It's just, you know, on the path that God is planned for her. I don't know that this is it. This route, to me, can be an eternal death. She may not see that, but there's a hope that if I can just stay there, you know, show the love, see what happens, and we have to take it day by day.
With the upbringing that we had, you know, we were taught that, you know, man and a woman and a man is bad and, you know, they're damned. And that's how we grew up. That's what we grew up thinking. But in time, I realized with regard to my child, this is the way he's felt on the inside for so long.
Merry Christmas, Gigi.
I mean, he could hardly speak when he was pulling on his tights saying, you know, this is not what I want and this is not who I am. I don't understand how you could be born that way and have that happen, and yet, you know, it's something that you could be damned for. It doesn't make sense to me.
Wave hi, everybody. Say hi. Say hi.
I always had a hard time making friends. I think part of it was that I was a very strange kid. I would just feel bad because every day I went to school, I just felt like everybody wanted me to go. Nobody wanted me there. Yeah, one time, this girl, we were in the girls' locker room, so we have to change for gym. She just went off on me. She was like, man, you're an ugly dyke, you know, you're a lesbian. It just kind of went from shaky to unstable to almost impossible. That's what it felt like. By the end, I was just trying to hang out. I started getting some anger issues in my sophomore year when I was very stressed out. Well, sometimes I would break and I would punch a hole in the wall or kick a hole in the wall or things like that. I would just get so mad. Eventually I could keep it from all spilling out, but it would spill in. I was just drifting off into this very violent experience into my head. Sometimes I would think about harming my family. The images just pop up in my head. It got so bad. And that's when I really decided, I feel like a threat to my family. I feel like a threat to myself. I just can't control myself. So, very late at night, I went down to my mom. I was just crying. And I said, hey, I want you to take me to a hospital. I want to get locked up.
That's what really motivated me, to know that he was in so much pain and that I could be causing it. That was too much for me. I just have to support him, and I kind of just have to figure out whatever's gonna happen is gonna happen. But today, he needs me, and that's what I'm gonna do, whatever he needs me to do.
You know, I guess I'm holding out on hope that, you know, could this reverse? There's a possibility. Is this going to move fully forward? And this is, you know, where G is going to go. That's a possibility too. I just can't make that switch just in for me, myself. I don't talk about anybody else. It's because it's a personal issue and where you're at. The choice for me is I can't go there.
The decision to make your transition at age 67. So my first question is, when did you know you had a diverse gender identity, and how did you come to understand it?
Well, hi, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here. And, you know, I'm glad I have an opportunity to share my story that hopefully will help other people. You know, I grew up in a place in a time, I grew up in New York City, actually in the Bronx, right? You know, in a tenement of all things. And I grew up in a place before GID was out in the public eye. You know, and you know, the only thing I saw in the daily news was like people like Kristen Georgeson and Renee Richards. They just struck my curiosity back then. And as a child, I remember, you know, going back, way back when, even I was like, think back like when I was like 5, you know, I'm kind of like, you know, you see myself in the mirror, you know, and we only had one bathroom that we shared. You know, we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, and you know, trying to hide my genitals, if you will, you know, and just kind of tucking them back and wrapping a towel around my body and my legs and sitting and pretending it was a skirt. And I just, you know, you don't think anything of it back then. I mean, God, I didn't know anything about this back when. I wish I grew up, you know, like 40 years later, I guess. But anyway, I used to love playing in my mom's closet. I just loved the smell of her perfume. She had this, you know, beautiful fur coat in there that, you know, I would just like love to just like the softness of it, I guess. And I just was intrigued by her clothes, and, you know, and she always relied on me to basically give her advice on what looked good on her. She didn't ask my dad or my other brother. And it was just always me that she, you know, she said, you know, you can tell me the truth. You know, I can always rely on you to give me a good opinion. So I know it's always different than other kids or boys, really. You know, I grew up and I was fascinated by women's clothes and fashion catalogs, magazines, you know, and my mom's makeup, you know, and I just didn't think, I didn't know what it was. I, you know, didn't have second thoughts about it.
So I want to kind of take you back to kind of what you were talking about a little bit earlier in the interview, and you described this relationship with your mom, and you said that she had sort of like an instinct about your I guess, capacity to advise her on clothing. And there was something that she intuited about you. And I wonder what sense you make of that in retrospect, when you think back to, you know, what your mom was discerning about, you know, how you were as a child.
I just remember she bought this red coat for me at a company, a place was called Cornell's, a children's store back then, the bright red coat. And I secretly, I loved it, okay, but I never wore it, you know, and it was this coat that I swear it looked like a girl's coat. But she said she bought it in the boys section, you know, but I mean, who back then, a boy, who would have a bright red coat? I mean, it was beautiful, but I never wore it because I was embarrassed to go out with it. I mean, I wore it in the house, but never went out. So I was a shy kid. You know, I was, you know, very worried about being embarrassed. And they'd have the play, you know, the day that's going to happen, right? You know, they give this costume, and my mom said, you know, hey, before you leave, let me put something on you to make you stand out. You know, it was lipstick, you know, and I love the taste of it. I mean, I couldn't believe it, but you know, back then I think the taste of lipstick was very unique, and almost had a fragrance to it, and I loved it. However, you know, I had to walk from my house to the school where the play was, and I was embarrassed like hell. And she made me promise not to wear it, you know, off. But I think that was the thing they did then, because I actually saw other boys with it, you know, when I got there. But I secretly loved it, you know, but it was a love-hate thing. And I was just kind of like, really, I was so worried about being embarrassed by things. You know, I you know, maybe that's something to do with my self-worth or something, you know, I don't know. But it was like an embarrassment, you know.
How do you think your sort of gender diversity affected your life as an adolescent?
I guess I'm not sure. I mean, it's certainly, if I look back now, I wish I had transitioned when I was a teenager. I mean, there's no question in my mind about that.
And if you look back on your life, you became this immensely successful person in your career, and you don't think that you would have been as successful if you had transitioned, but you still wish that you had been able to transition at a younger age.
And I was going to retire. I was going to basically just say, okay, I have transition. I'll never go back. But then I thought about it a little bit, and I said, well, you know, maybe it'd be, you know, if I leave this world, what's my mark on it? So I thought providing you know, somebody at my age, and particularly in leadership, you know, maybe being a role model to others, you know, and help setting some of the, you know, help my company, if you will, like, you know, the T part, right, that HR had never done before, had helped them through that, and be perhaps just somebody that could be, you know, people who were in the shadows, right, and who kept this, you know, hidden, that maybe would help them.
Powerful, powerful stuff, Kendall. I want to ask you, I guess, one final question, and that is, what message do you have for healthcare providers encountering adolescents and families that are navigating gender diversity?
You know, but I remember, you know, my regular doctor, you know, prescribes pills and medicines and surgeries, you know, and stuff. And, you know, the psychologists and even psychiatrists that I went to, you know, think that that would be of some help. You know, they didn't talk to each other, right? They didn't share a care plan, you know, between them. And it was very, you know, siloed, if you will. And also, you know, it wasn't, you know, I guess they didn't, I don't know, they didn't provide an atmosphere, I guess, that was open, you know, for people's deep, dark secrets, and particularly that might affect their career.
Kendall, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for your generosity and sharing, you know, this story. And I could probably talk to you for hours about this, but I'm so thankful and just in awe of how you are kind of determined to be a role model and to lead the way, and, you know, to kind of be a professional mentor, and then also a personal, you know, mentor to some of these folks that you're getting to know in your journey. So thank you so much. Thank you for showing that video, Sarah. I'm so excited now to turn this over to our amazing panel. And I'd like to introduce Malik Muhammad. Malik is going to be moderating our panel this afternoon. I'm not going to get into all the bio information. We have some beautiful bios of these spectacular contributors on our symposium website. But I will mute myself and allow Malik to take this over, and we will see you at the end of our training this afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Julie. Are you hearing and seeing me okay? Excellent, fantastic, thank you. I'm so honored to be here with you all this afternoon. Really excited to, one, be introducing myself. My name is Malik Muhammad. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I serve as the Associate Director of the Penn LGBT Center. I'm also a double alum of Westchester, so I have to say that I am so proud of the advocacy that my university is bringing forward. The EPIC program in and of itself, and this symposium has been absolutely phenomenal all day. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Dane. I'm so grateful for your expertise and your willingness to come and join and share with so many amazing people. Thank you to our attendees for coming and being willing to learn and grow, because I promise you, that is the first step. Having the opportunity to step in and be willing to grow and learn and bring forward this sense of integrated care for trans and gender diverse youth. So I'm excited to introduce our panelists for today. We have some amazing colleagues that have joined and volunteered their time to be here and engage with us today. So first up, we have Karen Dickinson, who is joining us as a school counselor. I encourage you, or in the field of school counseling, I encourage you to look at the website and read the full bio of this amazing woman. She uses she, her pronouns, and I have to say, I'm honored to call her a colleague. She was one of my professors and is a true friend. So thanks for being here today, Karen. We also would like to introduce today Elizabeth Grillo. Elizabeth, welcome. Elizabeth uses she, her pronouns, and she is joining us as a speech communication specialist, as well as working in gender affirming care, and more specifically, gender affirming voice care. So thank you, Liz, for coming in today and joining and sharing your expertise. Next up, we have Stacy Metz. Stacy Metz is joining us as a public health professional, and we'll be providing some of the health background that we need to have in this conversation as well. So Stacy, thank you for being here. And I know you're also going to be sharing a little bit of a personal experience as well. So we're excited to hear about that as well. Thank you, Stacy. Next up, we have Lena Queen, our dear Queen, who is here today, uses they, them pronouns as well as she, her. Lena is joining us to join and share some experience from social work. So thank you so much, Queen, for being here. We are excited to have you. Loving your glasses, please and thank you. And lastly, we have Nellie Lazar, who is also joining us today. Nellie uses she, her pronouns and is joining us from the field of nursing. Again, providing that healthcare perspective that we so greatly need. And I think Dane, you might also be sharing a little bit as we're in our panel today. So we'll reintroduce you and say thank you for being here with us today. So to get us started, to kind of kick us off in this panel, we want to get some reactions from the two videos that we just watched. Sharing the video about John as well as the video of Kendall. Thank you, Julie, for bringing those forward. To be honest, even me watching them, I was on one side heartbroken, but then also it felt very uplifting to, one, see folks who are willing to share their stories, because that in and of itself is so powerful. We've only gotten to where we are today because trans, non-binary, and gender diverse folks have been willing to share and bring that sense of vulnerability for us to have an understanding of how to appropriately support folks. So thank you to John and Kendall for sharing their stories. So I wonder, from our panelists, do we have any initial reactions on what those videos, how they struck for you individually, and also how they might have been supportive to our folks who are tuning in today? Anyone willing to kick us off with some reactions to our video?
I think I can react. Hi.
Got it, Nellie, go right ahead.
So I'm a nurse practitioner at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia in the Gender and Sexuality Development Clinic. So there I basically participate in the medical gender affirmation of children and adolescents. And I'm all too familiar with a case like John on the Frontline video, where one parent is struggling, the other parent may be accepting. And I was just thinking, what if John had not been able to go talk to his mom? And that was really emotional for me to watch, because knowing that my role as a healthcare provider prescribing hormones and pubertal suppression and menstrual suppression is only a small part of it. I really believe acceptance and love is the care plan for these kids. And so just having one parent that he was able to then go tell really, really just moved me.
Thank you so much, Nellie. I can echo that sentiment, right? It was so special to see that at least John had that one parent who was very supportive. And I think someone in the chat started to mention the coming out process is one that impacts all folks involved, right? Of course, the individual is the most impacted, is navigating that. But for those that are close to them, their parents, their family members, they are also going through a process of trying to figure that out. So it's interesting that we got to see some varying perspectives there, but it was so powerful that at least having that one supportive parent was something that gave John that sense of empowerment to continue moving forward. Thank you so much, Nellie. Any other panelists willing to share a little?
Hi, so I'm Stacy Betts, and I am coming to you as a public health and a social work professional, but also as a step parent myself of a brilliant, stellar teen son who identifies as transgender, and like John, experienced a number of challenges, especially in the early adolescent years. Fortunately, as soon as he came out to myself as a step parent and the entire family, there was just a wealth of support. And I think watching John's story, it was just very emotionally, start tearing up a little. It just, I can't imagine what my son's trajectory would be right now if, we didn't provide that backup, that support, really trying from the start to provide the open space, like holding space for him to openly discuss anxieties, ideas, frustrations, but also to kind of brainstorm how to address different microaggressions he was experiencing on an everyday basis, and not just in the school, but in healthcare environments, getting his blood drawn to donate. And so I'm just very thankful that, we are there for him. But I am grateful that one parent for John was there.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that, Stacey. As someone who you yourself is a parent of a trans teen, you can definitely resonate, right? Struck a chord for you for a moment. And I would just say kudos to you for being that supportive parent, right? Because as someone is even mentioning in the chat, that is one of the protective factors, right, of avoiding further trauma for trans folks and trans and non-binary youth. So it's so powerful to just have that supportive familial system. So thank you, Stacey. Anyone else?
Yes, I would like to ask a question of the panelists. So both Nellie and Stacey and Malik and others of us and people attending have recognized that the mom is really supportive. So how do we as professionals reach out to people like the father who are in a different place? So how, as we said, John is lucky because he does have a supportive parent. So what do we do for trans children and adolescents who don't have that supportive structure? How do we reach out to the father? How do we get him to be on the other side?
Excellent question, Liz. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about that.
So I do.
Yeah, Queen, please bring it in.
So I'm Queen All. Not only am I a licensed clinical social worker, but I am the owner of an outpatient practice that specializes in sexuality and gender in Delaware, Journey Wellness and Consulting Group. So coming from an outpatient perspective and having worked inpatient as well, going to Liz's question, well, twofold. One, the one thing I'm always looking at is resilience, because we often focus on, rightfully so, risk factors and protective factors. And, you know, I like to challenge some of what we do in treatment by looking at where resiliency shows up and where John showed resiliency, in order to go with, Stacy talked about addressing like those microaggressions, right? Those everyday microaggressions, and going to what Liz says of like how to get the dad to buy in. It's really by being, one, making sure, I don't know if everybody saw that whole frontline video, but it has a tendency to be very parent-centered and not very child-centered. So I think keeping that in mind, that it can be a both and not an either or, because oftentimes we don't allow an integrative approach that makes room for spirit to come into place, about mind, body, energy, and being able, or mind, body, spirit, and being able to use that as the caveat in treatment to bring dad in, because dad is coming from a place of coming from a place of faith, right? And how to be able to do that in a way that honors that, and also honors John's resiliency, if that makes sense. So I'll stop there.
That makes sense entirely. Thank you so much, Queen. Bringing forward that essence of resiliency, that essence of meeting the father where he is to help him move forward, right? And providing that sense. Dane, I think you wanted to share a little.
Yeah, I definitely want to dovetail off of what Queen just shared, because their conceptualization of resilience is super important. I wanted to also just submit a resource. So Dr. Matsuno, M. Matsuno, developed sort of out of the minority stress model, the TRIM model, the Transgender Resilience Intervention model. And I use that in a lot of my clinical trainings to clinicians. And it really breaks down the proximal and distal stressors that might contribute or exacerbate symptomology. And really, I think that we could take that model to be able to identify specifically where stressors may arise, where discordance may arise, where dysregulation may arise, and family issues may arise, to be able to walk the client to wholeness and wellness. So I wanted to name that resource that does undergird and support resilience. So thank you for bringing that up, Queen.
Yes, Dane, thank you so much. That's exactly why we're here today, right? To share resources, to give folks opportunities to really think this through. So if you can, please feel free to put that in the chat as well. Excellent, excellent. So I want to say again, thank you for providing a chance to think about that video, right? And what that did is it humanized so much of what we're talking through today, right? Because oftentimes, especially in academic fields, sometimes we talk about these things in very theoretical ways. Right? We're like, oh, this is happening, but to bring it home, to really make it personal. So thank you so much for tuning into those videos. I encourage you all to continue finding spaces where you can see and visualize trans stories, trans and non-binary stories, because they give us a window, especially for folks on this call who do not identify as trans or non-binary or gender diverse in any way. My cis folks on this call, make sure you are really tuning in and listening. Right? Even for myself, as someone that identifies as a cis man, I'm always doing my best to listen, validate, and uplift trans and non-binary experiences as much as possible, which is what we're talking through today. So thank you for your feedback on those videos. To lean in to our panel for today, I wanted to get started with kind of a general question, because we do have some individual questions that we're going to pose to each of you. But I wonder if we could just quickly give folks an understanding of, why do you believe this conversation is even necessary, and what brought you in? What brought you in? And I'm going to go ahead, if you don't mind. Karen, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks, Malik. I think somewhat as a school counselor, but just as a person, I have always wondered why people don't accept people for who they are and recognize strengths of the individual. So working in a school system for so long has led me to understand that we have antiquated systems of so many ways and so many bad policies, that the one place that children and adolescents spend the most time in school needs to be a place that's safe, needs to be a place that celebrates strengths, needs to be a place to lay a groundwork for prevention. My emotional response for Kendall was, I'm so sorry that it took such a long time, but I'm so grateful that she was able to tell her story, and for John as well. So for me, it's helping and supporting not just students in understanding who they are and celebrating that, but in helping all those who are around them to do that as well.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Karen. You said it so well. Our education system is where most of our children are spending a majority of their time. So how can they even effectively learn if they aren't even being validated in their identity? So, so important. Thank you, Karen. Let's come over to Queen. What you got for us?
Man, I became the person I needed. As a queer Black person who grew up in Delaware, which is an agricultural state, no matter how much we're on 95, I became the person that I needed. You know, the understanding the importance that 96% of queer and trans kids of color in the state of Delaware don't feel safe in schools, according to that Listen Report 2017, 2019, wasn't even need to do anything because the numbers didn't change, right? The fact that it also needed to be, wanted to challenge systems to be integrative and like whole, that honor the whole person, that honors the relationship between mind, body, and spirit. So I'm also an interventionist, right? Developing, you know, strategies and theories and things of that nature that really honored mind, body, and energy, mind, body, spirit, and how to bring that in. And as a gender fluid person, you know, it was something about language and understanding the relationship between identity and power, and having that understanding intersectionality without really having the language. So becoming an academic independent scholar practitioner, it was important to be part of not only the conversation, but part of the community. And that's why I'm here.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Queen. I really appreciate your emphasis on embracing intersectionality, not just as a theory, but in actual practice, right? And really allowing sometimes that data to drive how we move forward, but it goes beyond the data. It's the person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If it doesn't become tangible, where it's like in action, there's always been this disconnect between academia and practitioners, right? And then policies that inform all the things. So it becomes more important to have targeted conversations about that.
Exactly. That emphasis on holistic wellness. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The whole person.
Let's come over to Liz.
Hi everybody. So I'm a speech language pathologist, and I specialize in voice and also gender affirming voice care for trans and gender fluid individuals. And I want to thank Queen, because Queen has helped me on my journey. And so over the last couple of years, you know, so she's been a big help to me. And as I've gone through this journey, and so I'd like to thank Queen, but I'd also like to also thank the Westchester University Trans and Queer Advocacy Department on campus. They've also helped me through my journey. And I have just been very passionate about this. I want to help I want to help people who are exploring their gender to meet their full potential. And that includes communication and having their communication match their current gender expression and where they are in that evolution. So I'm excited to learn more. And that's why I'm here.
Yes, thank you so much, Liz. I think you bring up such a poignant point. All of us are continuously learning, and we have to be willing to continuously learn, right? Even us who are here as quote unquote experts in this field, we are still learning because it is about people, right? It's about the lived experience of people, and just having the opportunity to open the floor of learning is so important. So Liz, thank you for acknowledging that continued growth and continued learning, that hopefully we're all still on that journey. Let's come over to Nellie.
Hi again. I've been doing this work for I thought about it recently, about 20 years. When I was a school nurse and I started working with some trans feminine students who would come into my office and were buying hormones off the street and getting injections down the street. And I learned about a public health clinic in San Francisco that provide gender care to adolescents. And fast forward about 15 years, and now I'm at Children's Hospital, and there's kids who I treat for HIV who are also doing the same. So I really learned how to become a gender affirming care provider out of the need for my patients. And I'm doing this, I believe it's life-saving work, some of the best work I've ever done in my career. And I also want to make sure that other providers are trained, not just to be trans affirming, but trans competent, because our kids deserve this, and it's not taught in grad school. I didn't learn about gender care in grad school. I know a lot of physicians, nurse practitioners don't learn about gender affirming care. And so that's why I'm here. And I also provide trainings and go to different medical schools and nurse practitioner schools in the entire area, because I also feel very passionate about this work.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Nellie. Somebody has to do it, right? And as we learned with our videos and as we have been discussing today, it takes one person. It takes one person to provide some type of gender affirming care that will save a life. Mm-hmm. So to all of you that are on this call today, know that you have that power to be that one person that can change the trajectory of a trans or gender diverse person's life. Stacey, close us out.
Thank you. So I started working back in my 20s, working with adolescents in crisis intervention. And then I moved to doing and facilitating life skills and HIV prevention, health education types of courses. And it was then, working with some trans youth in foster care who experienced quite a bit of discrimination and prejudice in terms of what they could purchase depending on what their birth sex was. And I remember, working with a whole group of youth, some trans, some not, and, kind of going through like, well, how could we advocate? How could we develop an advisory board where youth would serve in a capacity to be able to advocate for needs at a state level? And seeing how things progress that way and change, and seeing confidence building. And I think that's what I've been trying to pursue ever since, is trying to find ways to empower folks to advocate, allies and individuals who are trans. And I hope it's helped, because my son is doing just that, writing letters to organizations, going up to the receptionist, offering advice. So that's where it all started.
Thank you so much, Stacey. And I'll tell you right now, even just speaking with you today, the couple of days that we had planning this, you're doing it. You are empowering folks. You're going to continue to do so. So thank you for all of your work. And that sense of empowerment is so important for the trans and non-binary, gender diverse individual themselves, as well as the folks who are doing the work to support. So I hope today has been helpful in getting folks to feel empowered that you can do it, right? So oftentimes folks avoid engaging with trans or non-binary patients or clients because they're like, oh, I'm not sure if I have the expertise. All you have to do is validate, right? And do the work on behind the scenes to have that competency, right? So again, I applaud folks for being here today, for their willingness to learn and grow. So we're gonna lean into some individual questions. So we heard from all of you, but now we're gonna hear from each of you with a specific question that'll kind of adhere to the field that you work in and the work that you do. So let me go ahead, let's see. Why don't we start with Karen? Karen, I'm coming back to you. Could you share a little bit on how can schools support gender diverse youth? What are some of those steps for schools to take to really support gender diverse youth?
So this is a great question, because it can, the answer could be simple, but so diverse, because schools can be depending on where you are, can be very political, they can be very policy laden. And so I'm going to take a global picture of that and say, basically, a school wants a student to succeed. And so schools from the very beginning, because children come in, they can't see me. Children can come into schools 5 years old, 6 years old, already questioning, understanding that there is something different about them, that they need to feel accepted where they are and learn how to grow into all their identities, and including academic, personal, social, sexual, career. And so schools can start from the very beginning with celebrating diversity of folks, celebrating that people come from different families, and just by curriculum, by policy, as much as the school can take in maybe a short-term versus a long-term goal to help all children feel safe and to help the climate feel very positive. So the way things like that can happen are through curriculum. It could be through classroom lessons for strengths, for interest. It could be through having books and representation of all people. It could be by teacher training, parent, guardian, adults in children's lives, training and workshops, and understanding that things might be different than what you think or what your culture has told you is a norm. So there are so many ways to start. If there's resistance, I ask you to try to figure out what that resistance is from. Is it from fear? Is it from not understanding and not knowing? So the awareness, just like today, I think there was a great amount of increased awareness. And as Malik said, that continues. That continues to keep looking for that and keep offering. So awareness in understanding more curriculum, understanding more trainings, celebrating and bringing into schools things like No Name Calling Week, Pride Month, other workshops, establishing GSAs, Gay Straight Alliances, getting allies together and supporting all students and helping with conflict resolution, helping with perspective taking, all things that are part of growing up and developing. I did have, and I think I'll put it in the chat, not just the GLSEN, but there are a couple things, a couple websites, Gender Spectrum being one of them, that have forms, that have different ways for schools to start. GLSEN has different ways for schools to start GSAs, for name changes. And so you don't have to invent everything on your own as well. There are things out there and resources. I think people have said this. I think Malik just reiterated it. Affirm, listen, affirm, and believe. And that is your foundation for moving forward to see what you need.
Thank you so much, Karen. I know, especially for our folks that work in education environments, that was definitely helpful. I think one thing I will just reiterate is that there's often times where school systems have a lot of policies, right? And you get a lot of pushback. Don't be afraid to challenge. Ask the question, why? And encourage folks to get back to the mission of what the school system is supposed to be in the first place. And if you allow that to be the foundation, usually you can back up, this is why we should be supporting our trans and gender diverse youth. So thank you so much for those amazing suggestions and that wonderful resource that you popped into the chat. I encourage folks to check it out. As someone that works in education, I've used GLSEN as well. It definitely comes in handy. Okay, let's come over to, okay, Liz, I think I want to hear from you. Could you share, because I think this will be good for folks that are in a variety of different fields, but especially in some of those more integrated types of spaces. As individuals transition and or explore their gender, what can we do to help them demonstrate their correct gender expression?
Sure. So I am, as I said earlier, I am a speech language pathologist. I'm a voice specialized SLP, providing gender affirming voice care. We are an important part of the interprofessional care team to support these individuals, these diverse gender individuals. So part of what our role is to do is to help them literally find their voice. So we are literally finding the voice, the communication interactions, both verbal, non-verbal, that matches their current gender expression. Also understanding that it's fluid, it's a spectrum. So giving them the tools to transition across that spectrum might also be relevant for that individual as well. So the voice includes pitch, loudness, quality, and resonance. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of the voice. And basically it's pitch, loudness, quality, and resonance of the acoustic signal. So basically whatever they're saying is something, in terms of voice that we help them manipulate. At Westchester University Speech and Hearing Clinic, we have graduate student clinicians that provide gender affirming voice care to clients under the direct supervision of licensed and certified speech language pathologists. We offer those services in person and also via telehealth. They are free. There is no charge. So we are providing services for people who may not have, financial means to do that. They can come to us and we can help them reach their true self. And then they're all trained by me. So they've all gone through courses with me and training with me, and they learn how to manipulate the anatomy and physiology of the voice production system so that they can teach these tools to the individual. And again, as I said earlier, there may be multiple voices that we're training because the individual may be at different stages in their transition with different people, in different settings. So we give them the tools and let them decide what is it you want to do, how you want to do it. I'll help you get there so that we provide all the possible options for them. And an example of this is a number of years ago when we first started providing this care at the clinic. We worked with a client who was in the later stages of her transition, and this was she said the voice was the last thing holding her up. Everything else, she was good to go, but this was so upsetting to her because this was holding her back. So we were able to give her the tools that she needed to be successful. She put that final piece together. She stepped over that final hurdle, and she was able to become her true self. So it's extremely rewarding, and these are wonderful individuals to work with, and I will support them in any way that I can.
Thank you so much, Liz. The clinic sounds phenomenal. And I think what you're hinting at is there are multiple levels to transitioning, right? And especially, again, for our cis folks that are on this call, this is something that you probably never even had to think about, right? And how do we really lean in and understand that there are those multiple levels of how a transition happens? And it was interesting, earlier today, Sandra was talking a lot about social constructs, right? And a lot of times when we think about this level of transitioning or gender expression, sometimes trans and non-binary individuals want to meet some of those social constructs, right? Or those social expectations to feel more affirmed in their own identity. So Liz, you're providing that opportunity, right? So I encourage other folks that are on this call today to think about how they may be able to provide that opportunity of affirming someone's expression in a variety of different ways. The way they dress, their hairstyles, their voice, their mannerisms, right? It all comes into play in terms of how someone feels affirmed in their identity, but also how they're being received by other folks. So important. Thank you so much, Liz. Appreciate that. So I think I want to lean over to staying in kind of the health world. Stacey, do you think you can provide, from a public health standpoint, how can we translate the experiences of trans and gender diverse youth into creating an inclusive and quality healthcare experience?
Absolutely, thank you. Because our youth who identify as trans and gender diverse are more likely to experience health-related disparities and other challenges, it's really key from a public health standpoint to have accurate data, but not just information about health status also on the social determinants of health. So what are the other aspects that are impacting their health status, such as social policies, school system, and other experiences like that. And to also elicit stories from folks. And I think Queen, you mentioned that as well, as making sure that we have those stories to be able to kind of monitor things over time to see what's changing. And that helps us as public health and other professionals within the community to be able to see if any programs or services or policies we're putting into place are making a difference. Something that worries me a little is that sometimes with nationally collected, like kind of population-based health-related data surveys that are being collected, many times it's an option for states to be able to collect information about gender identity and sexual orientation, making it more difficult for some states to be able to see if things are kind of changing over time. And so I know that the kind of the national public health agenda, Healthy People 2030, has actually formulated several objectives related to public health infrastructure, specifically for LGBTQ folks, to be able to increase the number of states and territories, putting in not just an item or two, but standard modules, and including that to collect data for and on individuals moving forward. But there are a number of wonderful resources right now to be able to inform things, such as just recently the 2020 PA LGBTQ health needs assessment survey that was conducted by Bradbury Sullivan Community Center, as well as the Public Health Management Corporation, in kind of connection to the PA Department of Health. And so those are excellent tools to be able to kind of get to know what's happening with the LGBTQ population over time. And that one in particular, I believe there's about 2,000 individuals they were able to talk to who are 25 years of age and younger, to be able to assist with larger program ideas and improvements. But I think it also speaks to getting those results back to, and I think somebody in the chat mentioned like getting it to the school boards, getting it to the folks in health systems who not only are the direct providers, but also the healthcare managers, the individuals who are kind of setting up things within the waiting room, and trying to ensure that health education materials are inclusive. So someone such as my son sees themselves in the materials. So those are just some ideas from the public health standpoint. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I think you bring up such a great point of public health is so much rooted in data, right? And how we collect information about how we are servicing LGBTQ plus youth. But then we also get an understanding of what's missing, right? So providing that chance for folks to really share openly and honestly in those spaces. And I think you also started to bring forward that notion of not just worrying about quantitative data, but getting that qualitative data as well, right? Because that is what we're really leaning into, is that lived experiences, especially of folks within trans and non-binary communities. So important. So leaning from that question, Nellie, I think you are a nurse practitioner over at CHOP, right? And working in adolescents. So I wonder if you could tell us about the team-based model of care that you all use at CHOP that might be useful for folks.
Thanks, Malik. I think today, all of the speakers, the panelists, all the videos have really highlighted how important each one of us are in providing support for gender diverse kids. And I'm very lucky to work with psychologists, psychiatrists, physicians, social workers, pediatric endocrinologists, a whole team over at CHOP, because my portion of the medical transition is so small. Like we heard about earlier, that vocal coaching is so important. We know that school support is so important. When somebody is referred into the clinic at CHOP, they meet with a team before they're ever referred to the medical team for any sort of medical transition. And we've had about 2,400 families referred to us since the clinic's inception. And so before they even come to us for any sort of medical care, they get to share their gender journey. And that's something Dane talked about earlier. I wrote it down, walk with the client empathetically. They get to share their gender journey, and then it's decided whether or not they actually need any medical transition whatsoever, whether that be what we talked about already, pubertal suppression or gender affirming hormones. A lot of the times the families need support, whether that be like for the frontline video, John's father might need support maybe from his clergy or spiritually or their own therapist. The patient might need support from their therapy. We actually have a school specialist as well who works with the schools if the schools are not providing, for example, the bathrooms that they need to provide. And so I'm just really lucky to work in such a diverse gender clinic where we have all of these services, knowing that not all trans kids have the privilege, have the resources to be able to access these clinics. So one of the things that Kendall said in her video is that she hoped that there are more gender services available to everyone. So that's sort of our model of care requires that there is guardian consent. And that also doesn't work for everyone, but I really do believe that getting to that point when a parent can consent and wrapping around acceptance by the family really can be life-saving for our patients. But again, acknowledging that that is not the model that works for every kid who may not have a family who's going to consent for them, or we find the resources that best meet their needs.
Nellie, thank you. I'll tell you right now, there are moments where I wish I was unmuted. How many times I would, you know, there's so much beautiful work being done. And I'm so excited to hear that your space is being so intentional of recognizing that this is an individualized experience. There is no one way to be trans or non-binary or gender diverse, right? And you have to be very intentional about meeting the needs of that person you're working with, right? We should not come from a place of assuming this is what you're going to need, right? Oh, let me get you this because I know this is what you're, well, you don't even know that's what I'm looking for. I didn't even say that I wanted to transition medically. Why are you even trying to provide this? I didn't ask for that, right? So meeting folks where they are, getting an understanding of what their needs may or may not be and supporting them. Giving folks options are great, right? Because sometimes folks don't even know that they have a need until you present the option for it. But at the same time, it's meeting folks where they are. So thank you so much, Nellie. You know, I'm also really intrigued because a lot of what we've talked about today, and especially in the world we live in today, folks are always talking about systems. They're like, oh, the system is this, the system is that, the system, the system, the system. Y'all, we are the system, right? So what are we doing to actually acknowledge a lot of the harm that is being done within our systems? Which leads me to my next question for our dear Queen. Queen, you ready for me? So I was wondering if you've, especially from the social work perspective, from that essence of kind of the societal perspective, could you talk a little bit about capitalism and colonialism and the impact that managed care has on, at times, pathologizing gender diversity?
I sure can. Y'all ready? Because I'm an artist, not to say. So I always start with humor. Humor is always good because, again, resiliency, right? So the one thing first, can we define managed care when we talk about systems too, right? We are part of a system. I think going back to Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's understanding of intersectionality is about the relationship between identity and power. It is not identity alone. Why is that so important? Because we have a tendency to have these one one-dimensional type of conversations, which managed care causes harm because we see people in their identity and not understanding the relationship to power, the power that we all sit in place of. So I think it's absolutely important to recognize that we are sitting in a place of authority, and we need to be mindful about that authority in which we hold space and build space for our clients, you know. So, and understanding too, managed care shows up in two ways: service delivery and clinical delivery. Service delivery is what I consider, you know, like school counselors, you know, what school counselors do for my practice, right? Front of the house staff, like how the team is actually supporting folks. And then the clinical delivery would be the psychologist, the psychiatrist, the speech therapist, the social workers, the nurse practitioners who are doing the clinical work. And I think being able to understand that managed care means that we have insurances that tell us yes and no, right? What Business Newsweek, I think Newsweek just had an episode, an article on insurance companies still saying like there's certain trans care that's not approved. So that comes into a part of accessibility. So we have to be able to talk about capitalism and colonialism and the impact, because what those two things do is commodify who has access to mental health care, medical care, voice care, right? It also defines care and not healing, that there are things that in managed care that's going to help a person in their healing journey, but can be also, there could be more than that. Understand the impact of colonialism. It has taken away and erased gender diversity of people of color, right? You know, just going back to what Dr. Sandra talked about earlier, is that gender diversity is found in every culture, but colonialism and the impact of colonialism has been to take away that understanding. You know, there's a lot of integration that needs to take place. And us being aware of that is important, because those things lead to what I call societal and sexual defaults, right? Messages that Dr. Bloom talked about, right? Talked about like white supremacy, talked about heteronormativity, cisgender, like talking about the defaults in which we all operate from. And then we have a tendency to pathologize a young person to be like, you really don't, are you sure 13 is old enough to know, right? We take away their agency and autonomy, their ability to make decisions and their ability to act on the decisions they make when we're looking at how can we get authorizations, when we're only looking at, you know, the managed care flow of things, and we're not honoring their healing journey and who they are in their whole self. That makes sense? So I think it's really important to be able to continue to understand how we all show up in our parts, and that it's a both and not either or, right? There's a lot of emotional labor that every last one of us as providers holds in our roles professionally. And then those of us who are parents and caregivers, right? We also too have a different way of understanding the lens if that was my child. It's something to honor and not ignore, so that way you don't go in with unintentional bias in how you're performing either clinical or service delivery.
Yes, Queen. Thank you. You're really bringing home this notion of no matter who you are, we are all a product of a heteronormative and cisnormative society.
Absolutely.
And a healthcare system that is rooted within that, an education system that is rooted within that. So we have to be willing to question, uproot, unlearn, right? And open our understanding of even checking ourselves.
Absolutely. You can't be lazy doing this work.
Yes.
You can't be lazy in doing this work. Laziness will cause harm. You can't be lazy doing this work. It's effort. And if you are tired, take care of yourself, right? Because the other end of that too is, how do we take care of ourselves when we too are experiencing burnout and fatigue and compassion fatigue? So where do we engage in our resiliency so that way we can show up and have those spoons to give to others?
Yes. As caregivers, we have to recognize that emphasis on self-care, right? How can I give and support someone else when I'm not even supporting myself, right? And again, meeting folks where they are and allowing ourselves to push back against so much of the isms that we have been taught in a variety of different ways, and especially in these quote unquote systems that we hold power in, right? We have to bring forward the power that we have to continue changing lives in the most impactful way that we can. Sometimes we're not gonna be able to help everybody, but we can help at least one person, right? So I want to say thank you to each of you for sharing. And we have one more share out that we would like to have in this moment. Stacy, you mentioned earlier that you yourself are a parent of a trans teen, right? So I wonder, as I said earlier, if we could personalize this a bit, because we've been talking about a lot. As we wrap up, let's really personalize this. Would you mind sharing what your experience has been like as a step parent of a teen who identifies as trans? You're muted at the moment, Stacy. There you go.
Okay, spacebar didn't work. What's wonderful is I spoke to him before this, and so we spoke specifically about healthcare and what were some of the frustrations and anxieties that really kind of took a while to work through. And so I think some of those examples are, first, I think it was just the anxiety of meeting new professionals, and you have the binary choice option on the intake forms. You don't know if they're going to be welcoming or not. He brought up something brilliant about it's much easier to know if a mental health provider is LGBTQ affirming, because online in profiles, it's what population served and what specialties do folks have. However, it's not as out there and present for GYN, for primary care physicians, pediatricians. And so every time he would meet a new provider, it was the anxiety of having to tell the story again, not sure if the person's going to be welcoming, and sometimes that anxiety or just having to think about that overshadowed the real reason why he was going to visit the provider. And I think we kind of reached a point where we would have loved if providers would have kind of asked more questions about his identity, because we went to the Mazzoni Center to be able to explore different options, and not just the surgical options, but also the non-surgical options, for instance, what Liz was talking about. And so I think that provided such confidence in just knowing what all the options were for gender affirming care, and being and meeting with professionals who were comfortable discussing it. And so he just automatically knew that folks would be welcoming. But I think, with Mazzoni Center, we live about an hour away. And so access is an issue for many teens like him and others who live further out. And so I think, one big thing that I see is, wanting to advocate for more providers to seek continuing education, but not just that, to have it like embedded in curricula. So allied health professions across the board would be fantastic. Then I think, so once we kind of move through kind of the social affirmation, the, learning more about medical, we kind of moved to legal. And then in the name change process was at least 2 years long, because it's not just about the courts. And I was privileged enough to be able to hire a lawyer to help us through that process, but I know not many can. And so I wish that process would be a little bit easier, because it's not about state forms, it's also county forms. You call folks and it's not the right form, you find out. And with COVID, everything had to be done via mail, but then you need to change the birth certificate. and have that court material to get that. And that was all by mail. And then to get the social security card, you need the birth certificate changed and the legal documents to get that changed. And then you need all that for your license and for, so it was a lot. It was a lot, but I'm glad that we could walk through that journey together and that he felt comfortable asking questions and just not being alone through that process, because it was frustrating for me. So I can't even imagine what it was like for him. So I just, thanks to all the panelists for all the fantastic work you do as well.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Really appreciate you sharing that, for your vulnerability as well as your child's. We know you got permission from them to be able to share, so really, really appreciate that. You brought forward so many amazing points, and we see this so often. There is an extreme mistrust and anxiety-ridden experience for folks who are even attempting to get healthcare, or they just avoid it entirely because they assume that folks will not be able to have the competency or the affirming nature that they deserve and need, right? And then also thinking about the level of access to resources is not the best, right? So how do our spaces think about that level of access, being more accessible to folks? Are we willing to travel to people instead of them traveling to us, right? Being considerate, and then also embedding this type of education within healthcare education overall is greatly needed. We're seeing different forms of this education coming through, but it's still not integrated across the board. So we love to see more of that. Dane, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I want to quickly just speak to the issue that Stacey raised about, and this is directly related to integrative care. A few years ago, I was in a hospital for 56 days, unrelated to any gender-related issues. I was in a car crash. And so there were a couple of things that happened. On the ER table, asked evasive question, really, before they even attended to my need. And so my leg was completely crushed as a result of the accident. And so they were asking me questions about past surgeries on the ER table. The reason why I mention this is because where do people who don't even have understanding of the systems to be able to get what they need and to be able to advocate for equity literally on the table of surgery? And so especially if it's not related to gender or their transition related needs. And so I had to explain to an occupational therapist while I was there about my body, because in their 20-year career they had never encountered a person of experience. In addition to that, I was literally almost, they had me tried to make me sign the discharge paperwork without even actually conducting physical therapy or rehabilitation. And so they were, I guess for the cursory level, they were supposed to at least do it once. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is if you don't know all of these pieces and know what your rights are, and also know the different types of professionals that are going to be at the beck and call of your care or involved in your care process, it can be a very convoluted and very disheartening process. So I had to do educating while under medication and on the mend, to occupational therapists, to the social work team, to be able to ask who my lead nurse practitioner was on the floor, to be able to have my needs met, just to be able to be discharged correctly. And so when we're talking about integrative care, I really want to draw home the point of impact to trans and non-binary people. And it doesn't always have a lot to do with gender-related care, but when we're in the medical system, we have to be really cognizant of, as professionals, how we expand our community, expand our network. So I can say, oh, I know a voice person. Oh, I know a great nurse practitioner in the Pennsylvania area, to be able to close that loop, close that gap, and to be able to, that's really what the deconstruction of this medical model is about. It's about finding those gaps, but speaking to them and providing a little bit more equity, providing a bridge so that we can ease access. And so I just wanted to paint that picture about how really important building that community, a diverse community of professionals is. Thank you so much.
Exactly why we are here today. So thank you so much, Dane. You have provided a great way of kind of thinking about how we wrap this up. So one, thank you for bringing your personal experience in to, again, personalize this, but really making it clear that the integrated care is exactly what we need to make sure folks are getting their needs met in a variety of different ways. So let me say one more time, thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. Your expertise and wisdom was greatly, greatly appreciated. Dane and Sandra, absolutely phenomenal earlier. I want to provide one piece of homework for all of our attendees today. I promise you, coming here for the past 5 hours is amazing. You've done some great work, but it has to continue. I don't need you saying, okay, check this off. I did this training, now I'm good to go. Or no, I got these CSU credits, yay, excellent. No, here's what I need you to do. 1, think about who is your team. Who is your integrated team that you are putting together? 2, how are you checking in with yourself on how you are supporting gender diversity? And lastly, how can you continue this conversation within your teams and broadly? Because we had a number of people here today, but how do we get this out further? So thank you all for being here today. I'm going to turn it back over to Julie.
Wow, this was incredible. I could listen to this panel for another hour, another 2 hours. You know, Nellie saying, you know, not just trans affirming, but trans competent. Stacy talking about embedding this in the curriculum. Thank you, Malik. And thank you, panel, for your vulnerability, your expertise, and sharing your interprofessional magic with us. As you reflect on today, I hope you come away brimming with a new confidence to support our children. Thank you all for being here.